Silas Vane didn't knock. That was the first thing Evelyn noticed, the way he walked through the front door of the Calloway ranch house, like he owned every plank of wood beneath his boots. He didn't wait for anyone to answer. He didn't call out a greeting. He simply walked in, set his hat on the table without being invited, and looked around the room with the slow, measuring gaze of a man, calculating what something is worth before he decides to take it. Wyatt stood near the fireplace. He had the look of a man who had been standing in the same spot for a long time, shoulders tight, jaw set, hands at his sides. He did not offer Silas a seat. Silas sat down anyway. "You're 2 weeks behind," Silas said. "I know what I am," Wyatt said. Silas smiled. It was the kind of smile that had nothing warm in it. "I came to give you a chance to make it right before things get uncomfortable." He glanced toward the kitchen doorway toward Evelyn, who had gone still the moment she heard boots on the floor. "Didn't realize you had company. She's my wife," Wyatt said. Silas looked at her for a long moment, not the way a man looks at a person. The way a man looks at a piece of furniture he isn't sure he wants in the room. Then he turned back to Wyatt and continued talking, as if she hadn't spoken, as if she wasn't standing 6 feet away, holding a ledger she had been reading for the past hour. 2 weeks, Silas said again. "After that, I'll have to start making other arrangements." He picked up his hat. He left without closing the door behind him. Evelyn stood in the kitchen doorway and watched Wyatt's back. He didn't turn around for a long time. When he finally did, his face had closed off in that way. She was already learning to recognize that flat, practiced expression that meant he had decided not to say anything because he didn't know what to say. She looked down at the ledger in her hands. She had been on this ranch for less than 12 hours, and she had already found 3 things that didn't add up. She didn't say anything either. Not yet. But she kept reading. If you've ever watched someone work quietly in the background while everyone else missed what they were doing, if you've ever been the person in the room that nobody thought to ask, then this story is going to stay with you. Before we go any further, if you're new here, please take a moment to subscribe and hit the like button. It helps more people find stories like this one. And leave a comment, tell me what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to know how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to the beginning. Evelyn Marsh had not expected to like Kansas. She had not expected to dislike it either, exactly. She had simply not thought much about what Kansas would feel like, because when you are 26 years old and you have run out of reasonable options, you don't spend much time imagining how the wind will smell or whether the sky will feel bigger than you're used to. You think about whether the man who answered your letter will turn out to be decent. You think about whether you made the right decision. You think about whether you will be able to sleep in a strange house without lying awake for hours, listening to sounds you don't recognize, wondering what you left behind. She had left behind a town that was smaller than it looked on a map, a house she had shared with her grandmother until her grandmother died and left her the house, the 12-acre property attached to it, the bread starter she had kept alive in a crock on the kitchen shelf for 40 years, and no instructions for what to do next. The house had a leaking roof. The property taxes were 3 months overdue. The bread starter was the only thing in genuinely good condition. The man who placed the advertisement had been honest, at least. Wyatt Calloway, age 34, owner of the Calloway Ranch in Harding County, Kansas. Prosperous operation. Seeking a wife who can manage a household. Practical arrangement. Letters responded to promptly. He had not described himself as handsome or kind or looking for a great love. She had respected that. She had written back in the same tone, direct, factual, no promises she didn't intend to keep. She told him she was capable, organized, and not easily frightened. She told him she could cook, keep accounts, and work hard without being asked twice. She did not tell him she was also, when pressed, more stubborn than any person had a right to be. He had written back. They had corresponded for 6 weeks. Then she had packed what she owned, sold what she could, and taken the train west. Wyatt met her at the station. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had spent too many years in the sun and didn't particularly regret it. He shook her hand before she could decide whether to offer it. He said, "You look like your letter." She wasn't sure if that was a compliment. He loaded her trunk into the wagon without asking if she needed help, which she didn't, and they rode the 8 miles to the ranch, mostly in silence. He pointed out landmarks. The creek that ran along the eastern fence. The grain storage building, he called it the feed barn, and he said the word with a flicker of something she couldn't read yet, a tightness around the eyes that came and went too fast. The bunkhouse where the hands slept. The main house, which was larger than she had expected and in better repair, though the porch steps had been fixed recently, and you could see the new wood against the old. She noticed things. She had always noticed things. It was not a skill she had cultivated on purpose, it was just the way her mind worked. Her grandmother had called it a gift. Most people she had known had called it something less generous. The kitchen was in good order on the surface, clean enough. supplies stocked. But the first time she opened the pantry and started checking what was there against what the household would actually need, she felt something sharpen inside her, that particular feeling she got when numbers didn't match the story they were supposed to be telling. There were 3 months of grain records on the shelf beside the back door. She didn't know why she picked them up. Habit, maybe. Or the same instinct that had always made her read the fine print before she signed anything. She read them twice. Then she went to find the main account ledger. Wyatt was outside. She could hear him in the yard, talking to one of the hands in a low, steady voice that measured quality he had, like he chose each word before he said it. She sat down at the kitchen table with the ledger and the grain records side by side and spent the next 40 minutes doing arithmetic in the margin of an old receipt. By the time she heard Silas Vane's boots on the porch floor, she had already found it. She didn't sleep well the first night. That wasn't unusual. She hadn't expected to. New house, new sounds, knew everything. The wind had a different pitch out here than it did back home, and it came from a direction she wasn't used to, and it didn't stop. She lay in the dark and listened to it and thought about the numbers she had written in the margin. Wyatt had gone to bed without saying much. He wasn't unfriendly, exactly. He was just contained, like a man who had gotten used to keeping things inside because there was no one around to say them to. She didn't take it personally. She understood it better than she expected to. In the morning, she got up before sunrise, which was something she had always done, and which she did now without thinking about it. She lit the stove, made coffee the way she liked it, strong enough to stand a spoon in, and put water on to heat for oatmeal. She found the oats in the pantry and measured them, and then stood at the stove and thought about the grain prices. The Calloway Ranch was buying grain from Silas Vane at 43 cents per bushel. She had checked, over the course of the morning, because she wasn't the kind of person who made accusations based on a single source. She asked the hand named Dooley, who came in from the barn early for coffee and was more talkative than the others, whether there were other suppliers in the county. He looked at her sideways and said most of them had stopped dealing with Vane 2-3 years back because he'd undercut them all, and now he was really the only game in town for operations Calloway's size. He said it matter-of-factly without suspicion. She thanked him and poured him a second cup. 43 cents per bushel. The market rate, from what she had been able to gather, was closer to 28. She did the arithmetic again while the oatmeal cooked. She had been doing it all night, in the back of her mind, in the way numbers sometimes lodged themselves, and refused to let go until you'd worked through every implication. The difference was 15 cents per bushel. The Calloway Ranch bought in bulk. She went back to the records and counted how many times in the past 14 months they had purchased grain from Silas Vane. The number she arrived at sat in her chest like a stone, more than $400 over 14 months. In a county where most families made it through a year on half that, Wyatt Calloway had been paying Silas Vane $400 more than he should have. And based on what she had seen in the ledger, that number was accelerating. The most recent delivery had been priced even higher than the ones before at 47 cents, quietly slipped into the column like it had always been that way. Like maybe nobody was looking closely enough to notice. She had noticed. She didn't say anything at breakfast. Wyatt came in from the yard, washed at the basin, sat down and ate without looking at her much. She poured him coffee without asking and sat across from him with her own cup. The grain, she said after a moment. He looked up. The price you're paying Vane, she said. It's wrong. Wyatt set his fork down slowly. He had the expression of a man who had been interrupted in the middle of a thought he hadn't finished yet. What do you mean wrong? I mean, it's not the market rate. It hasn't been for a while. She kept her voice level. She was watching his face the way she always watched faces when she said something that mattered, trying to read whether he was going to get angry or get quiet or get somewhere useful. I went through your records last night. Something shifted behind his eyes. You went through my records. I didn't know where else to start, she said honestly. I needed to understand what the ranch was working with. I should have asked you first. But you were asleep, and I couldn't sleep, and I had already found the grain receipts. Wyatt looked at the wall for a moment. Then he looked back at her. How wrong, she told him the number. She watched it land. His jaw tightened. He picked his fork back up and set it down again without using it. Vane's been supplying this ranch for 4 years, he said. I know. He's got more of the county's grain contracts than any other supplier. I know that too. He was quiet for long enough that the wind filled the silence. What are you saying exactly? She folded her hands around her coffee cup. I'm saying someone has been slowly raising your prices while everything else stayed the same. And I'm saying if that's been happening with grain, I'd want to look at the other supply accounts before I assumed it wasn't happening there too. She paused. You have the records. I'd like to help you look. Wyatt Calloway sat with that for a while. She was learning, a fast man. He thought before he spoke. He turned things over. She respected that even when it was inconvenient. Finally, he said, "You found this in one night." "I couldn't sleep," she said again. He looked at her for the first time that morning, really looked the way you look at a person when you're trying to figure out if they're what they appear to be. Then he pushed back from the table and said, "I'll pull the rest of the ledgers." The hands didn't know what to make of her. That was clear enough from the first morning. They were polite, Dooley especially, who seemed to operate on a general policy of goodwill toward most people, but they were cautious in the way men are cautious when something has changed in their environment, and they haven't decided yet whether that change is good or bad. She was the boss's new wife. She had arrived yesterday. Now she was in the kitchen at 5 a.m. reorganizing the supply pantry and asking questions about grain prices, and none of that was what they had expected. She didn't push. She had learned a long time ago that pushing was rarely the fastest way to get anywhere. What she did instead was cook, not for any strategic reason at first. Cooking was simply what she did when she was working through a problem, something about the physical rhythm of it, the measuring and timing, and the way you had to pay attention without overthinking, seemed to let the other part of her brain keep sorting through whatever needed sorting. She made cornbread for noon dinner that first day, and biscuits the next morning, and on the third day, when she had a window of time before anyone needed the oven, she mixed the bread starter her grandmother had given her, the one she had brought all the way from home, in a clay crock packed in straw, and let it sit. The honey apple loaves were her grandmother's recipe. Not complicated, on the surface bread flour, the starter, a small amount of dried apple she had soaked overnight, and a careful pour of wildflower honey that had to be added at precisely the right temperature, or it killed the culture. Her grandmother had made the same bread every week, for as long as Evelyn could remember. The smell of it baking that warm, specific sweetness with the tang underneath it was the smell of the house where Evelyn had grown up, of winter afternoons and being small and safe. She hadn't planned to make it so soon. She hadn't planned to make it for the hands. But the timing worked out, and she had the ingredients, and there was something grounding about doing something so familiar in a place that was so new. The loaves came out of the oven at 3 p.m. She set them on the counter to cool. By 3:15, Dooley had appeared in the doorway with the expression of a man who has just smelled something and cannot identify the source, and is compelled by every instinct he has to locate it. "Ma'am," he said, "is that bread?" "It is," she said. He looked at it with an expression of barely suppressed hope. Are you planning to?" "There's enough," she said. She sliced 3 loaves and put them on the table with butter she had made herself that morning from the cream the milk cow had provided, which was more than enough and was going to waste otherwise, and she went back to the pantry to finish her inventory. 20 minutes later, she came back to find the loaves gone, and 4 ranch hands looking at the empty table with the specific sheepish dignity of men who know they have done something slightly embarrassing, but cannot bring themselves to regret it. That was Dooley started. "The best thing that's happened on this ranch in about 2 years, said the hand called Marsh, who was not related to her and who she had not previously heard say more than 6 words at a stretch. She didn't say anything. She put the butter crock back in the cold cabinet and made a note in the household ledger. But she kept baking. It was Wyatt who finally said it out loud. They had spent 3 evenings going through the remaining ledgers together, him pulling them from wherever he kept them, her reading and noting and doing the arithmetic he didn't ask her to do but didn't stop her from doing. He sat across the table from her and watched her work. He asked questions sometimes. Sometimes he just watched. On the 4th evening, he spread out the current year's account pages and sat back and looked at the total she had written at the bottom of the column. "This is bad," he said. "Yes," she said. He ran his hand over the back of his neck. It was a gesture she had come to recognize the equivalent in him of a long sigh. "It's been bleeding out for over a year and I didn't catch it." The changes were small, she said. It wasn't a comfort exactly. She wasn't trying to make him feel better. She was just being accurate. A cent here, 2 cents there. The kind of thing you don't notice unless you're looking for it. "I should have been looking. You had other things to look at," she said. "You've been managing a full ranch operation. The grain accounts were running, and nothing had broken down, so you had no reason to assume anything was wrong with them." She paused. "That's probably how he counted on it working." Wyatt looked at her. "Bane. He's not stupid," she said. "The overcharging has been going on long enough and steadily enough that it's a pattern. This didn't happen by accident." She watched him work through that. She watched him want to argue with it. Because that's what you do. When someone tells you that you've been played, you look for the version where it isn't true, where there's a simpler explanation, where you don't have to accept that someone you've done business with for 4 years has been deliberately taking money out of your pocket. She had seen that process happen in her grandmother, when the tax collector in their town had been found to have been skimming for 6 years. The initial refusal, the anger, the grief almost. Because it wasn't just about the money. It was about trust. It was about what you thought you knew. What does he want from this? Wyatt said finally. Not a rhetorical question, a real one. She had been thinking about that since the first morning. I don't know the end of it yet, she said. But it's not just the money. If it were just the money, he'd have taken it faster and gotten out. This has been slow. This has been patient. She looked at the ledger. He's not bleeding you dry. He's making you weak, slowly. Wyatt was quiet for a long time. Why? Because a weak rancher can't negotiate. A weak rancher can't say no. A weak rancher with a debt problem and a supply problem and not enough leverage to go looking for someone else to buy from. She stopped. What happens when a rancher in that position can't make his payments? Wyatt's face had gone very still. He loses the operation. Or he sells at whatever price he can get, she said. To whoever is standing there offering one. He looked at her across the table. The lamp was low. Outside the wind had picked up. It always picked up at night here, she was learning. She had been on the ranch 6 days. You got all of this, Wyatt said slowly, from a grain receipt and 1 night of insomnia. 2 nights, she said. I still haven't slept that well. He almost smiled. It was the first time she had seen anything close to it. What do we do? She had already been thinking about that, too. First, we stop assuming we have no options, she said. Second, I want to understand what the other supply accounts look like, not just grain. Third, she hesitated. Because the third thing was the one she wasn't sure how he would take. I have a business idea, a small one, but I think it could help. Wyatt raised an eyebrow. The bread, she said. People want it. Your hands have been talking. Dooley mentioned that someone from the camp up the road asked him about it. She kept her voice matter of fact. I could sell it, not just here in town. He was quiet for a moment. You want to sell bread. I want to build something that doesn't depend on Silas Vane, she said. And I happen to be good at bread. He looked at her for a long time. She had the feeling he was trying to decide something not about the bread exactly, about something larger. All right, he said. All right, you'll think about it? All right, we'll try it. He pushed back from the table and stood. Don't let me get in your way. She looked at the ledger. She looked at the months of overcharging laid out in the columns. She looked at the number that still sat in her chest like a stone, because knowing where the problem came from didn't make it go away. They were still 2 weeks from a payment Wyatt couldn't fully cover. Silas Vane was still the only grain supplier for 40 miles. And whatever the man was planning, it wasn't finished yet. But they were not out of options. Not yet. She picked up the ledger and closed it. She would start in the morning. She started with the waste. Not because it was the most important problem she knew by now, that the grain overcharging was the wound that actually mattered, but because the waste was visible, was immediate and fixable without anyone's permission. And fixing things you can fix, while you're working on the things you can't fix yet, is how you keep from going crazy. The kitchen at the Calloway ranch had been run by a succession of hands who cooked because someone had to, not because any of them particularly knew what they were doing. That was evident from the first time she opened the cold cabinet and found 3 pounds of salt pork that had been sitting long enough to be questionable, half a wheel of hard cheese that had gone dry at the edges, and a crock of lard that had been left uncovered long enough to absorb everything around it. She threw out what was genuinely gone. She salvaged what she could. She reorganized what remained by use, things touched daily up front, things for weekly cooking behind, things for storage in the back where they wouldn't get in the way. It took 4 hours. She did it alone, because she didn't ask for help with things she could do herself. Dooley appeared in the doorway around mid-morning while she was reorganizing the dry goods shelf. He leaned against the frame with his coffee cup and watched her for a minute. You know, he said, the last fella who tried to sort that pantry gave up after about 20 minutes. What happened after 20 minutes? She asked without turning around. He found something in the back that he didn't want to look at too closely and decided the whole situation wasn't worth it. What was it? Dooley considered. Honestly, we still don't know for certain. She glanced back at him. He was grinning. She turned back to the shelf. I've been in worse pantries, I believe that, he said. He watched her work for another minute. You need anything? Not right now. But I'm going to need someone to help me carry the spoiled barrel from the far corner out to the yard later this afternoon. It's heavier than it looks. I'll send Marsh, he said. He's stronger, and he complains less than me. She almost smiled. Thank you. He topped off his coffee and left. She kept working. By noon, the pantry was organized and she had a list specific annotated, with quantities and priority markers of what needed to be restocked, what could be stretched, and what she could produce in-house rather than purchasing. The lard, for instance. She could render her own if she had access to the right cuts, which were cheaper than buying the rendered product, and which she could control for quality. The dried beans they were buying pre-sorted cost more than buying them loose from the feed merchant and sorting them herself, and which took 20 minutes a week and saved 12 cents per month. 12 cents per month was not a fortune. But 12 cents here and 8 cents there and $1 saved on something else was how you stopped the bleeding while you worked on the actual wound. She brought the list to Wyatt at noon. He read it at the kitchen table while she put food on. He had the expression he often had when she gave him something to read, that careful, word-by-word attention that she had first read as skepticism and was starting to understand was just how he processed information. He turned the page. He went back and reread something. "This is good," he said. "It's a start," she said. "The supply overcharging is still the main issue. But we can cut overhead here while we work on that." He set the list down. "You find anything else in the accounts? I want to go through the equipment maintenance records this afternoon if I can." She put a plate in front of him and sat across with her own. "There's a pattern with the grain. I want to know if the same pattern shows up anywhere else." Wyatt picked up his fork. "Vane doesn't supply the equipment." "No, but someone does." She cut into her food. "And if Vane has been running this kind of scheme long enough to feel comfortable, it's worth asking whether he's the only one." Wyatt looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at his plate. "You think like a lawyer," he said. It didn't quite sound like a compliment, but it didn't sound like a criticism either. "I think like someone who's been cheated before," she said. "Or watched someone get cheated. It amounts to the same thing." He didn't ask her to explain that. She was glad. There were things she wasn't ready to talk about yet, and her grandmother's tax trouble was one of them. They ate in silence for a while, the comfortable kind that she was starting to recognize as something specific to Wyatt, a quietness that wasn't absence but rather a kind of presence. He didn't fill space with noise. She was not entirely unlike him in that way. "I want to go into town," she said, "this week if possible. I want to talk to the merchant on Main Street, the dry goods place Heller's, and find out what the going prices are on the staples we're buying from Vane. Vane doesn't supply dry goods." "No. But Heller might know who supplies what in this county and who's been buying what, and whether anyone else has had the kind of pricing problems we're having." She picked up her coffee. "People talk in dry goods stores. It's one of the more reliable facts about human nature." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "I'll take you in Friday," he said. She baked every morning. This was not a business decision yet, in those early days. It was closer to necessity. The bread starter needed feeding regardless. And she had never in her life been able to let a crock of culture sit unattended without doing something with the discard. Her grandmother had raised her on the principle that a kitchen that isn't producing is a kitchen that's losing ground, and that was one lesson that had gotten into her bones early and stayed. The honey apple loaves were the ones that people wanted. That was clear from the first week, and then clearer as the second week went on. The hands ate them faster than anything else she made. Dooley, who was becoming something of a designated representative of ranch opinion on the topic, informed her solemnly on a Wednesday morning that in his professional estimation, the bread was the kind of thing a man would ride an extra 3 miles out of his way for, if he knew it was waiting. She looked at him. "How far is the mining camp up the road?" He blinked. "The Carver camp? 1.5 miles, maybe 2. And how many men are up there?" "Shifts change, but 35 maybe, when they're full up." She didn't say anything else. She turned back to the stove. But she was thinking. The idea that had started as a flicker the week before had been growing steadily, the way ideas do when you've been feeding them information without quite meaning to. She had been watching the ranch's finances. She had been watching the pantry. She had been watching the hands eat bread, and she had been thinking, in the back of her mind, about what her grandmother had told her once, about the difference between cooking to feed people and cooking to build something. Her grandmother had run a small trade from the kitchen for 11 years. Not a formal business, nothing with a sign or a ledger, just a steady arrangement with 4 or 5 households in town who placed standing orders for bread and preserves and, occasionally, the honey apple cake that people seemed to lose their sense of proportion about. It had never made them rich, but it had made them stable, in years when stable was hard to come by. Evelyn had helped with it from the time she was 8 years old. She knew how it worked. She looked at the crock on the shelf. She looked at the pantry she had reorganized, and the flour she had inventoried, and the dried apples in the burlap sack in the corner. She did some arithmetic in her head, not complicated arithmetic, just the basic math of what it cost to produce a loaf, and what you might reasonably charge for one, and how many you could produce in a day if you were working the oven at full capacity. Then she went to find Wyatt. He was in the yard with one of the fence hands, looking at a section of post that had heaved over the winter and needed resetting. She waited until the other man had walked off before she said anything. "I want to try selling the bread," she said. Not just talking about it. Actually doing it. He turned to look at her. The sun was behind her and she couldn't quite read his face. "How much are you thinking?" "To start 20 loaves a week. 10 to the mining camp, if they'll take them, and 10 to sell in town on market day." She had already worked out the numbers. At 20 cents a loaf, that's $4 a week. That's not nothing, it's not, he said. It grows if it works. If the camp wants more, I can make more. If I add preserves or pastry, the margin goes up. She paused. I'm not saying it saves us on its own. I know it doesn't, but it's something we control. Vane can't touch it. Wyatt looked at her for a long moment. The wind moved through the yard. Somewhere in the barn, one of the horses knocked against a stall board. What do you need? He said. Access to the oven for 4 hours every morning, she said, and someone to help me carry the product to market on Fridays. That's all. He thought about it. She watched him do it, that unhurried working through that she had stopped being frustrated by and had started simply waiting for. He wasn't slow because he was doubtful. He was slow because he was thorough. She could respect that, even when it made her impatient. Dooley can take you in on Fridays, he said. He's been going in for supply runs anyway. Thank you, she said. She turned to go back to the kitchen. He said, behind her Evelyn. She stopped. Don't let it get in the way of the other thing, he said. The accounts. She turned around enough to look at him. I won't, she said. I've never been able to do only one thing at a time. He almost smiled again. She was starting to be able to identify the almost smile, a slight change around the corners of his mouth, a fractional shift in whatever wall he normally kept up. She filed it away and went back to the kitchen. The first Friday, she took bread into Harding. She sold all 10 loaves by 10 in the morning. It happened fast enough that she was briefly unsure what to do next. She had set up at the far end of the market row, not the best spot, but she hadn't expected a better one. Not for a first outing, and she had priced the loaves at 18 cents rather than 20, because she wasn't sure yet what the market would bear. She had lined them up on the board she'd brought and put the small jar of preserves she'd made from the dried apple scraps at the end. Not quite sure if anyone would want it, and within 40 minutes there was a small cluster of people around the board, and by 10 o'clock there was nothing left. The preserves had gone first. A woman in a good dress who had clearly come to town for something specific had stopped, smelled the jar, and bought it without asking the price, which told Evelyn something useful about the pricing strategy she should be using. She stood with $2 in her pocket and an empty board and thought carefully about what she had just learned. You make all that yourself? The voice belonged to a man she didn't know, older, weathered, with the particular squint of someone who spent a lot of time in sun and wind. He was looking at the empty board. I did, she said. How much for a standing order? 10 loaves a week, delivered to my camp. She looked at him. Which camp? Carver operation, up the North Road. He pulled out a coin purse. My men have been eating Cook's biscuits all winter, and I've had more complaints than I care to count. That bread you had smells like something worth paying for. How much? She did the mental arithmetic in approximately 4 seconds. 18 cents a loaf, delivered on Tuesdays. If you want 10 a week, that's $1.80. I'd need a deposit for the first 2 weeks before I start. He didn't blink. He counted out $3.60 and put it in her hand. Name's Carver, he said. I run the camp myself. If the bread's as good as it smells, I'll want more. She put the money in her pocket. It will be, she said. Not boastfully, just as a statement of fact. He walked away. She stood with her empty board and her $4 and something that felt, for the first time in weeks, like a foothold. She found Dooley at the wagon and told him they were done for the morning. He looked at the empty board. That was fast, he said. Yes, she said. Good fast or bad fast? Good, she said. I need to think about how to scale the oven time. He nodded, with the expression of a man who doesn't quite follow the specifics but can recognize when something has gone well. Marsh is better at building things, he said. If you need a second oven set up in the yard, he might be able to rig something. She had not thought of that. She looked at Dooley with new appreciation. I'll talk to him, she said. She went to Heller's Dry Goods that same Friday, while Dooley waited with the wagon. It was the kind of store that existed in every small frontier town, not large, not organized in any way that made sense to an outsider, but somehow containing most of what you might need if you knew how to find it. The man behind the counter was Heller himself, which she gathered from the name painted above the door and the proprietary way he arranged himself behind the counter. She bought what she needed: dried currants, an extra bag of flour at a price notably lower than what Wyatt was paying Vane for comparable product, a jar of rendered lard that confirmed her suspicion about production cost savings. She was pleasant, she asked, in the course of paying, what the general going rate on grain had been running lately. Heller looked at her sideways. Depends who's selling. Roughly, she said. He named a figure, 26 cents. She kept her face still. That's lower than I'd heard, she said. Someone was telling me it was higher. Might be, he said. Depends on the arrangement. Some folks got locked into prices from a while back and haven't renegotiated. He gave her a look that was not quite a warning and not quite a commiseration. Sometimes it pays to ask around. It does, she said. She thanked him and left. She sat in the wagon on the way back to the ranch with her purchases in her lap and the number in her head. 26 cents. Wyatt had been paying 43 and then 47. Silas Vane was not just overcharging. He was nearly doubling the market rate and had been doing it long enough that the Calloway account showed it as normal. She did not say anything on the drive home. Julie filled the silence with a story about a horse he had once known, which seemed to be a general category of topic he returned to when conversation felt necessary. She listened with part of her attention and thought with the rest. She had the what. She had the numbers. What she still didn't fully have was the why, not the surface why, which was money, but the deeper one. What did Silas Vane want from Wyatt Calloway specifically? There were other ranches in the county. There were other operations he could have picked. But the Calloway ledgers showed a deliberate, sustained pattern that had been going on for over a year. That wasn't opportunism. That was a plan. She was going to need to understand the plan. She got her first look at what the plan might be 3 days later, in the most mundane possible way. She had gone through the equipment maintenance records the way she'd told Wyatt she would, and she had found nothing alarming. The equipment supplier was a different company out of Topeka, and the pricing was in normal range. But in doing that review, she had come across a folder tucked behind the ledger pages that held copies of correspondence she hadn't seen before. Letters from a land registry office, from a company called Western Range Holdings. She didn't know that name. She read the letters once, then again. They were formal, dry, the kind of language that land registry correspondence always uses, not quite threatening, not quite friendly, just neutral in a way that all by itself managed to feel like pressure. The substance of them was an inquiry, repeated across 3 letters sent over the past 8 months, about whether Wyatt Calloway would consider an offer on the Calloway Ranch property, including the southern pasture and the water rights attached to it. Each letter politely noted that Wyatt had not responded to the previous one. Each letter restated the offer, which was lower than the last. Each letter mentioned in passing that the company was aware of various pressures facing operations of the ranch's size in the current market and remained interested in a conversation. The third letter was dated 6 weeks ago. She sat with the folder in her lap for a long time. Then she went to find Wyatt. He was in the feed barn. She waited until she had his full attention. She had learned to wait with him, because trying to talk to him when his attention was divided meant repeating herself, and she disliked repeating herself, and then she put the folder on the grain barrel between them. "Have you seen these?" she asked. He looked at the folder. Something in his face shifted. "Where did you find those?" "Behind the ledger pages in the equipment file." She kept her voice neutral. "Do you know who Western Range Holdings is?" "A land company," he said. "Out of Wichita, I think." "I didn't look into them much." "Why not?" He picked up the top letter and looked at it. "'Cause I wasn't selling, Wyatt." She made herself say this plainly because she needed him to hear it. These letters are timed. The first one came 2 months after the grain prices started going up. The second one came after another price increase. The third one came 6 weeks ago, and 6 weeks ago is also when the grain price jumped again to 47 cents. She paused. "Someone is squeezing you, and then someone is offering to buy you out. And the offers are going down each time." He was quiet. "Do you know if Vane has any connection to Western Range Holdings?" she asked. "I don't know," he said. He said it slowly, like a man who is realizing he doesn't know a great many things he probably should. "I want to find out," she said, "before the next payment deadline." Wyatt set the letter down. He looked at the barn wall for a moment. "You think this is connected?" "I think it would be a remarkable coincidence if it weren't," she said. "And I don't believe in remarkable coincidences when there's money involved." He looked at her. In the low light of the barn, with the dust hanging in the air between them and the horses moving quietly in their stalls, she could see the weight of it settling on him, the particular tiredness that comes not from physical work, but from understanding that a problem is bigger than you thought it was. She recognized it. She had felt it herself, looking at the ledger that first night. "We're going to be all right," she said. Not because she was certain of it, because she thought he needed to hear it, and because she believed it enough to say it. He looked at her. "You don't know that." "No," she agreed. "But I know we have more to work with than we did 2 weeks ago. We know what the problem is now. That's not nothing." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What do you need?" "I need you to ask around carefully about Western Range Holdings. Don't make it obvious. Just ask. Someone in town will know something." She picked up the folder. "And I need a few more days with the accounts before the payment deadline." "You've got them," he said. She left him in the barn and walked back toward the house. The wind had picked up the way it always did in the late afternoon, and it pulled at her hair and flattened her skirt against her legs. She walked into it without slowing down. What she hadn't counted on was Silas Vane finding out about the bread sales. She didn't know how he found out. That was the thing about a county this size. Information moved in ways you couldn't always trace, through channels that weren't obvious, and by the time you heard something, it had already been around the circuit twice. What she knew was that on a Tuesday morning, 2.5 weeks after she had started the camp deliveries and the market sales, a man came to the ranch who was not Silas Vane himself, but who worked for him. She gathered this from the way he delivered his message, which was politely worded in the way that all thinly veiled threats are politely worded, he told her, standing at the kitchen door with his hat in his hand. Mr. Vane had heard she'd been selling food products at the Harding Market, and that Mr. Vane wanted her to know that the Market Association had certain vendor registration requirements that he didn't want her to run afoul of, given that she was new to the area and might not be aware of them. He was sure it was nothing she needed to worry about, as long as she had everything in order. She looked at him. He was young, younger than she'd expected, with a scrubbed, earnest face that suggested he was uncomfortable with the errand he'd been given. She didn't blame him for that. "Tell Mr. Vane thank you for the concern," she said. "I'll look into the registration requirements." She closed the door. Then she stood in the kitchen for approximately 30 seconds. Then she got her coat and told Dooley she needed to go into town. The Market Association office was in the back room of the town hall, which also served on different days as a records room and a polling place, and apparently a storage space for broken chairs. She found the clerk, a tired-looking woman named Mrs. Prentice, and asked, in the most straightforward terms she could manage, what the vendor registration requirements were. Mrs. Prentice looked at a ledger on her desk, and said that for sales of food items produced on private property, a vendor was required to register with the association and pay a $2 annual fee, and that was essentially the whole of it. $2, Evelyn said. $2, Mrs. Prentice confirmed. Evelyn paid the $2 on the spot, collected the registration certificate, and thanked Mrs. Prentice for her time. She was registered by noon. On the way out of the town hall, she ran into the very man who had come to the ranch that morning. He was standing near the front steps, talking to someone. He stopped when he saw her, and she watched his face go through a brief, complicated series of expressions. She nodded pleasantly and kept walking. That evening she told Wyatt what had happened. She watched him work through the information, the warning that hadn't been a warning, the registration that took 20 minutes and $2. "He's testing you," Wyatt said. "I know," she said. "He wanted to see if I'd back down. And you registered today, this afternoon." She set the certificate on the table. "The thing about someone who relies on people being afraid to ask questions," she said, "is that they're not well prepared for the ones who just go ask." Wyatt looked at the certificate. He looked at her. "What's next?" "I want to expand the bread sales," she said, before he thinks of something harder to block. She had already been thinking about scale. The camp delivery was reliable income now. Carver had been as good as his word, and his men had apparently responded to the bread with the kind of enthusiasm that was generating its own word of mouth. She had gotten a message through Dooley from a second camp, smaller, asking about availability. She'd also been approached at the last market by a woman who ran the boarding house on the main road and wanted to discuss a standing weekly order. The oven, as currently configured, couldn't handle all of it. Marsh had already rigged a secondary setup in the yard with stones and salvaged iron, and something he had built that he called a Dutch barn box, which Evelyn had no other name for but which worked better than she had expected, primarily because Marsh had tested it 6 times before presenting it to her, and had adjusted it each time based on results, which was more engineering rigor than the original kitchen oven had probably ever received. With both the kitchen oven and the yard setup running, she could produce 40 loaves a day. 40 loaves a day at 18 cents each was $7.20. Per day. Per operating day, she couldn't run it every day. She needed the rest of the morning for the ranch accounts, which were still an ongoing project, and she needed Wyatt to understand that she wasn't turning into a full-time baker at the expense of everything else she was doing. But 4 days a week was manageable, and 4 days at $7.20 was $28.80 per week, against the ranch's normal expenses, was not nothing. She was running the numbers in her head, at the kitchen table late at night when she heard Wyatt come in. He had been out late. She had heard him talking to the night hand about something, and before that she had seen him ride out toward the eastern pasture in the late afternoon, and not come back until well after dark. She had not asked why. She was learning not to ask why until he was ready. He came into the kitchen and poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down heavily across from her. He looked tired in a way that wasn't just physical. "I found out about Western Range Holdings," he said. She set her pencil down. "They're not from Wichita," he said. "Or they are. But that's not where the money comes from. Someone in town, I won't say who. But they know the county land records better than most. Told me that the company shares a registered agent with 2 other land outfits that have been buying up distressed properties in 3 counties over the past 4 years. He paused. "And the registered agent is a lawyer in Dodge City who also does work for." He stopped. She waited. "Silas Vane," he said. She sat with that for a moment. Not because she was surprised she had more than half expected it, but because hearing it said out loud was different from suspecting it. It made it real. It made it a thing that had been happening to them, deliberately, by a specific person who's decided that their ranch was worth taking and had gone about creating the conditions to take it. He's been doing this to others, she said. It wasn't a question. 3 other ranches, Wyatt said, all smaller than mine. 2 of them sold, the third one. He stopped again. The third one had a fire. The kitchen was very quiet. Who knows about this, she said. Right now? Us, the person who told me. Maybe a few others who've put pieces together. We need to get it in front of someone who can do something with it, she said, before he figures out that we know. I know, Wyatt said. She looked at him across the table. He looked older tonight than she had thought of him before, not old, not defeated, but carrying something that had gotten heavier recently. She thought about the ranch, about the years he had put into it, about what it meant to have something that was yours, and to find out it was being systematically taken from you by someone who had been standing right in front of you the whole time. I'm sorry, she said. He looked up. For what? That this was happening, she said, before I got here, that you were dealing with it without knowing what it was. He was quiet for a moment. You found it, he said. 10 days in, I'm good at finding things. Yeah, he said. I see that. There was something in his voice when he said it, not gratitude exactly, or not just gratitude, but something more complicated, more specific. She didn't try to name it. She looked back at her numbers. I need the bread business to be bigger before the next deadline, she said. I need it to be real enough that it shows in the accounts. Real enough that the bank can see it. She picked up her pencil. Can you give me 6 weeks? He looked at her. 6 weeks for what? To build something that makes us harder to squeeze, she said. 6 weeks in full use of the yard setup and marsh for 2 mornings a week. He looked at the table. He looked at the ceiling. He rubbed the back of his neck in that way he had. 5 weeks, he said. The payment deadline is 5.5 weeks out. She nodded. Then 5 weeks. What if it's not enough? She met his eyes. Then we'll deal with that when we get to it, she said. But it's going to be enough. She didn't know for certain that it was. She knew the numbers she was working toward, and she knew the gap between where they were and where they needed to be. And she knew that gaps like that don't close easily or cleanly, or without things going wrong in the middle. But she also knew what she was capable of, and she knew what was at stake, and she had not come all the way to Kansas to watch a man like Silas Vane win. She turned back to the ledger and kept writing. The letter arrived on a Monday, not delivered by the post the way normal correspondence came dropped at the box at the end of the main road, picked up on the weekly run into town. This one was left at the front door of the ranch house sometime before dawn, which meant someone had ridden out specifically to leave it, in the dark, without announcing themselves. That alone told her most of what she needed to know before she opened it. She had been up since 4:30. The bread schedule demanded it. The starter needed to be fed, and the first batch mixed and left to proof before the yard setup was hot enough to use, and the timing on all of it had become, over the past 4 weeks, a kind of domestic machinery that she kept running through a combination of habit and stubbornness and very strong coffee. She found the envelope when she stepped onto the porch to check the weather before starting the outdoor fire. She brought it inside. She set it on the table. She finished measuring the flour first, because the bread didn't care about envelopes, and the timing on the first proof was unforgiving. And she had learned a long time ago that if you let every interruption pull you away from the thing you're doing, you end up with nothing finished and everything half ruined. When the first batch was mixed and covered, she opened the letter. It was from the County Land Registry Office. Formal language, stamps, the correct official signatures in the correct places. It informed her that a claim had been filed against the 12-acre property she had inherited from her grandmother, the property she had brought documentation of when she came west, the property that was hers outright, no mortgage, no dispute, no complication. The claim alleged an error in the original title transfer and requested a review proceeding. She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at the wall for a moment. The 12 acres were in Kansas. She had transferred them when she moved, done everything the way you were supposed to do it, paid the filing fees, kept the copies. The property wasn't connected to the Calloway ranch. It was a separate parcel she had inherited clean and clear. She had brought it to the marriage as her own, and it was hers in a way that nothing else in her current life fully was yet. Not the kitchen she cooked in, not the house she slept in. Her 12 acres were the one thing that had been hers before any of this started, and someone had just filed a claim against it. She didn't need to look at the registry office name to guess who had prompted the filing. The timing was specific enough. She had been expanding the bread business for 4 weeks. The camp orders were solid. The boarding house order was solid. and she had picked up 2 additional customers from the last market day, a hotel kitchen and a feed merchant's wife, who wanted 6 loaves a week, and had told 3 of her neighbors, who had also asked. The numbers were getting real enough to matter, real enough to threaten the picture Silas Vane had been carefully building. She heard Wyatt's boots on the stairs. He came into the kitchen in the pre-dawn way he always moved, unhurried, aware with the particular alertness of a man who has spent enough years ranching to wake up already paying attention to his environment. He looked at the letter on the table. "What's that?" she told him. She watched his face go through the initial stillness, the slow tightening around his eyes, the jaw setting. He picked the letter up and read it himself, all the way through, with that careful word-by-word attention that she had long stopped mistaking for slowness. When he finished, he set it down in exactly the same place she had. "Your property," he said. "Not a question." "Mine," she said. "Clear title. I have all the documentation. Can they do this?" "They can file the claim," she said. "Whether it goes anywhere is a different question. But it takes time to fight, and time is what we don't have a lot of right now." He poured himself coffee and stood at the counter for a moment. "This is him." "Almost certainly," she said. The timing is stopped because saying it out loud made it ugly in a specific way. "He's not going after the ranch directly. He's going after me. Separate and apart from you." Wyatt looked at her. "Because if he can tie me up in a land dispute," she continued, "it pulls my attention off the accounts. It costs us money in fees or legal work, and it sends a message." She paused. "He wants me to understand that he can reach things that are mine personally, not just the ranch." The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of the starter working on the counter, that faint, alive bubbling that she had always found oddly reassuring, the evidence of something doing exactly what it was built to do. She listened to it for a second. "I'm not backing down from the bread sales," she said. "I didn't ask you to," Wyatt said. "I know." She looked at him. "I just wanted to say it clearly." He set his cup down. "What do you need?" She had been working on the answer to that question since she'd read the letter. "I need to find out who the filing attorney is and whether there's a counterfiling process I can initiate. And I need to do that without spending money we don't have on fees we haven't budgeted for." She folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket. "But first I need to get the bread in the oven, because Carver's delivery is tomorrow and I'm already behind." Wyatt looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his face that she couldn't quite name, not admiration, or not just that. Something more conflicted than that. "I'll ride into town this afternoon," he said. "I'll ask around about the attorney." "Thank you," she said. She tied her apron and went out to start the yard fire. The 5-week deadline had come and gone before she fully understood what it had cost them to get through it. They had made the payment barely. The bread income had come in at better than she'd projected, which she had not allowed herself to feel good about, because she had known from the beginning that the first wave of any new business runs hot before it levels off, and she didn't want to build plans on numbers that weren't going to hold. The Carver camp had been reliable. The boarding house had been reliable. The 2 new customers from market day had both placed second orders, which was a better sign than the first order, because a first order might be curiosity, and a second order meant you were doing something right. But the payment had taken almost everything the bread sales had generated in 5 weeks, plus what Wyatt had in reserve, and what was left in the account afterward was thinner than she was comfortable with. Thin enough that one bad week, one missed delivery, one problem with the oven, one lost customer would put them back at the same edge they'd just climbed off. She didn't tell Wyatt the number exactly. He knew it was close. He had the ledger in front of him often enough to understand the terrain. But she didn't sit him down and say the specific figure, because she didn't want him to make decisions from panic, and she had noticed that Wyatt Calloway, under enough pressure, had a tendency to want to simplify a problem by making one large, definitive move rather than working through it piece by piece. That quality had probably served him well in other contexts. In this one, she needed him patient. What she was not prepared for was the grain. She came back from a Tuesday delivery to find Wyatt in the yard with a face like weathered stone, and Dooley standing nearby with the particular look of a man who has just delivered very bad news, and is hoping not to be the next person spoken to. "What happened?" she said. "Vane cut the delivery," Wyatt said. She looked at him. "He cut? What does that mean, cut?" "He sent word this morning. He's reducing our allotment by 60%, effective immediately. Some line about supply constraints and regional prioritization." Wyatt said it flatly, like he was reading from a document he didn't believe. "He's got enough contracts that he can make it sound reasonable." She did the arithmetic immediately, the way she always did. The ranch needed a full grain allotment to feed the livestock through the rest of the season. Without it, they would start running short within 3 weeks. After that, they would have to buy emergency grain from somewhere, and the only somewhere close enough to matter was going to cost them significantly more than even Vane's inflated rate. Or they would have to make decisions about the herd that Wyatt would not want to make. When is the Harding Harvest Festival? She said. Wyatt stared at her. What? The festival? Harding does a harvest festival. I heard about it at market last week. When is it? He looked at her like she had asked about the weather during a house fire. 4 weeks, he said, but I don't see how large is it? It's the biggest commercial gathering in the county, he said slowly. Vendors from 3 counties come in. Railway buyers, sometimes. Why? She was already thinking through it. The festival was a known quantity in the county. She had heard enough about it at market to understand that it was the kind of event where serious money changed hands, where relationships were made, where a product could go from local to regional if the right person tasted it and liked what they found. She had been thinking about it as a future target, something to build toward in the spring maybe, after the bread business had another month or 2 to stabilize. 4 weeks was not spring. 4 weeks was now, which was not comfortable, which was not her preference. But the grain cut had changed what comfortable meant. I want to take the bread operation to the festival, she said. Dooley's made a sound that was not quite a word. Wyatt said carefully, That's a large operation. Yes, she said. You'd need to produce more in 1 day than you've produced in a week. Yes. You don't have the equipment for that kind of volume. No, she agreed, not yet. Wyatt looked at Dooley. Dooley looked at the sky, with the expression of a man who has decided his role in this moment is to be very interested in clouds. How much would it cost to get ready? Wyatt asked. Not as much as you're thinking, she said. Marsh built the yard setup for almost nothing. If he and one other hand can extend it more stone, another iron rack, maybe a 3rd Dutch box if he thinks the design holds, we can triple the output. She looked at him steadily. And I want to add preserves and pastry, not just bread. The festival draws people with money who are looking for quality, and I can give them quality at a price they'll pay. This is a gamble, Wyatt said. The grain cut is a gamble, she said. He's forcing our hand. I'd rather choose how we play it than just try to survive it. Wyatt put his hands on the top of the fence post between them. He looked at the yard, at the setup Marsh had built, at the main house, at something she couldn't see. The wind moved through the yard. The horses in the pasture beyond were small dark shapes against the flat horizon. All right, he said. She nodded. She turned to Dooley. Is Marsh in the barn? Should be, Dooley said. I need to talk to him about the 3rd Dutch box, she said, and walked toward the barn. The 4 weeks before the festival were the hardest she had experienced since arriving. She was not someone who used that word lightly. Hard. Hard was relative, and her frame of reference included 2 years of managing her grandmother's declining health, while also keeping the household from falling apart, which had required a specific kind of endurance that she had not fully appreciated at the time, because she had been too busy doing it. But these 4 weeks were hard in a different way. Not the grinding way that caregiving was hard, but the high-wire way, the constant awareness that the margin for error was very small, and that a mistake in one part of the operation could cascade into something they couldn't recover from before the festival date. Marsh extended the yard setup in 6 days. He did it with salvaged stone from the eastern fence repair pile, and the 2 additional iron racks she had ordered from the blacksmith in Harding, and a 3rd Dutch box that he informed her he had figured out how to make more heat-efficient than the second one, which meant the first one was now the least efficient thing in the yard, and could she tell him when she had a spare 4 hours so he could rebuild it? She told him she would find him 4 hours somewhere. He went back to work. She had drafted a production plan on the 3rd night after Wyatt agreed to the festival. She had been up until past midnight working through it, not just the bread quantities, which were significant, but the preserves and the pastry, and the order of operations for the festival day itself. A production failure on festival day was not recoverable. She would have 1 chance. She had also, in the same 4 weeks, continued working on the grain situation, the land claim, and the accounts. The land claim, she had learned through Wyatt's inquiries, had been filed by an attorney named Pruitt, who operated out of a shared office on the south side of Harding. Wyatt had gone to talk to him. She had considered going herself and decided against it, because she thought a woman showing up at a lawyer's office alone to ask about a claim filed against her would be treated as an opportunity for delay and condescension, whereas Wyatt showing up and being very large and very quiet tended to produce faster results. She was not above strategic deployment of her husband when the situation called for it. What Wyatt had learned was that Pruitt was not going to tell him anything useful directly, but that Pruitt was nervous, not the comfortable nervousness of a lawyer who knows his case is solid, but the uncomfortable nervousness of a man who is doing work he doesn't fully understand for a client he isn't sure about. Wyatt had reported this without editorializing, but she had been able to read the subtext clearly enough. He's a tool, she said, not the hand holding it. That's what it felt like, Wyatt said. Can we contest the filing without an attorney of our own? He said technically yes, but that it would require documentation submitted to the registry office within 40 days of the original filing date. He looked at her. That's 4 weeks from the day the letter arrived. 4 weeks, festival day was in 4 weeks. She took a breath. I'll prepare the documentation myself, she said. I have everything I need, the original deed, the transfer papers, the filing receipts. A counterfiling just needs to present them in the correct order with the correct forms. You know how to do that? I know how to read instructions and follow them exactly, she said, which is generally what's required. She had to borrow 2 evenings per week from the production schedule to work on the counterfiling. She documented it in the household ledger as administrative work and moved the evening baking she had planned to mornings, which meant getting up at 4 instead of 4:30, which was survivable. The hands noticed she was sleeping less. Dooley mentioned it once, in the sideways way that Dooley mentioned most things. She told him she was fine, and gave him an extra slice of bread from the test batch, which seemed to satisfy his concern. What she didn't tell any of them was that the land claim had rattled her in a way that the grain cut hadn't. The grain cut was an attack on the ranch, which was Wyatt's and also hers, but it was a business attack, cold, financial, the kind of thing she could counter with numbers and plans and strategy. The land claim was different. Her 12 acres were the only thing in her life right now that were entirely hers, that predated this marriage, that existed independent of everything she was building here. Silas Vane had reached into that and put his hand on it, and even knowing she could contest it, even having the documentation and the process and the timeline all laid out in her head, it still made something in her chest go tight in a way that the accounting problems hadn't. She didn't tell Wyatt this. She wasn't sure she had the words for it yet. 2 weeks before the festival, Silas Vane came to the ranch himself. She was in the yard when he arrived, working on the third batch timing with Marsh, who was fine-tuning the temperature on the rebuilt first Dutch box in a way that required her to be present and paying attention. She heard the horse and looked up and saw him ride in through the gate with a kind of easy authority that suggested he had done this many times and expected to keep doing it. He dismounted at the rail. He looked at the yard setup, at the 3 Dutch boxes, the racks, the flour sacks stacked against the house wall, the production operation she had built over 4 weeks. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at her. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked over. Marsh did not move from his position at the rebuilt box, which she noticed and was quietly grateful for. Mrs. Calloway, Vane said. His voice was what it always was, smooth in the specific way of a man who has spent years cultivating smoothness because he found it useful. Mr. Vane, she said, that's quite an operation you've got going. He gestured at the yard with a slight, almost appreciative movement. I didn't realize you were this serious about it. I am, she said. He nodded slowly. Industrious woman. He said it the way you'd comment on the weather, a neutral observation, meaning nothing, meaning everything. I came to speak with Wyatt. He's in the south pasture, she said. I'll let him know you came by. Vane looked at her. She looked back. The yard was very quiet except for the fire under the Dutch box and the faint sound of wind in the grass beyond the fence. There might be a way to make things easier, he said. For everybody. I'd hate for all this hard work to get complicated by things that don't need to be complicated. She kept her face entirely still. Things like what? He smiled. Well, that land matter, for one. Registry filings can be messy. Take time, money? He looked at the yard again. I understand you've got a big day coming up at the festival. Wouldn't want anything to derail that. She looked at him for a moment. Not because she didn't know what he was saying, she knew exactly what he was saying, but because she wanted him to be certain that she knew. I appreciate the thought, she said. The documentation on my property is in order. I'm not concerned. He held the smile for a beat too long. Of course not, he said. I'll catch Wyatt another time. He tipped his hat, mounted his horse, and rode out the same way he had come in. She watched him go. Marsh appeared at her shoulder. That was Vane? Yes, she said. What did he want? To see how scared I am, she said. She turned back to the Dutch box. What's the temperature reading now? Marsh blinked at the shift. Then he said, better. Up about 10 degrees from this morning. Good, she said. Let's run the third batch timing again, she told Wyatt that evening. He listened without interrupting, which was how he always listened. And when she finished, he was quiet for long enough that she knew he was working through the implications. He came here, Wyatt said. He did, to threaten you. To suggest that things might get complicated, she said, in that polished way he has. Wyatt stood up from the table. He did not say anything for a moment, and she watched him work through whatever was building behind his eyes, something that was not entirely controlled, which was unusual for him. He walked to the window and stood there looking out at the dark yard. I want to be clear about something, he said. His voice was quieter than usual. This ranch is mine, and everything I have is at stake in the next 4 weeks. I understand that, but the way he walked in here and talked to you. He stopped. He came back to the table and sat down. I don't like it. Neither do I, she said simply. What does he actually want from us? In the end, she had been thinking about this with more specificity over the past 2 weeks, since the land claim and the grain cut had given her more information. I think he's been trying to get you to a point where you need to sell, she said, and I think he wanted to get there before you understood what was happening. The overcharging was meant to drain the reserves quietly. The Western Range letters were the offer he expected you to eventually accept, out of desperation, at whatever price he set. She looked at the ledger between them. What he didn't count on was someone reading the accounts. He didn't count on you, Wyatt said. She shook her head slightly. He didn't count on anyone. That's the thing about that kind of plan. It only works on people who don't look. It's not actually that sophisticated. It's just patient. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. And the land claim? The land claim is the new move. Once I started the bread business and started reducing the financial pressure on the ranch, he needed a different kind of leverage, something that targets me personally. She folded her hands on the table. It's meant to distract me, divide our attention, maybe cost us enough in time and energy that we go into the festival underprepared. Will the counterfiling hold? I believe so. The documentation is solid. She paused. I submit it next week. Wyatt nodded. He looked at the ledger. He looked at her. I've been thinking about the festival, he said. About what you need. I have the production plan. I know, he said. I mean, beyond that, you need hands on festival day. More than you have, he paused. I want to help. She looked at him. I can haul firewood, he said. Tend the ovens, keep the setup running. Whatever you need. He said it matter-of-factly, like it was obvious. It's not a question of whether it's beneath me or whatever. I can do it. And you need people who can do it. She had not expected that. Not because she thought him above it. Exactly. But because she had come to understand that Wyatt Calloway's way of showing up for something was usually in a saddle with a direction in mind, not standing at an oven with a log in his arms. He was offering to be useful in a way that was not natural to him, and she recognized the effort in it, even if he had phrased it as if it were nothing. I'd be glad for it, she said. He nodded once and said nothing else about it. The week before the festival was the longest of her life. She had been through hard weeks. She knew what they felt like from the inside, the way time stretches and compresses at the same time, the way everything feels slightly more fragile than it actually is, the way small setbacks take on disproportionate weight because you're already carrying too much. She knew this. She tried to hold it in perspective. She mostly succeeded. She submitted the counterfiling on Monday. 3 copies as required, with the original deed and the notarized transfer papers and the filing receipts from the original registration. She did not use an attorney. She formatted it exactly according to the registry instructions, which were detailed and not particularly difficult to follow if you were willing to read them carefully 3 times before you started. The clerk at the registry office had looked at her documentation, looked at her, and said, with something that might have been reluctant respect, "This is complete." "I know," Evelyn said. She submitted it, paid the counterfiling fee from the household account which she had budgeted for specifically, and walked out. On Tuesday, she ran a full test production using all 3 Dutch boxes plus the kitchen oven simultaneously. The purpose was to identify every point where the process could break down before it broke down on festival day. 3 things broke down. The timing sequence on the 2nd and 3rd boxes ran 5 minutes out of sync. The honey apple loaves needed 2 additional minutes in the rebuilt first box, and the preserve jars she had ordered from the supply store turned out to be 3/4 the size she had expected, which meant repricing. She fixed all 3. She stayed up until 11 o'clock repricing the preserves. On Wednesday, Silas Vane's man came back. Not Vane himself this time, the young, uncomfortable one who had come at the beginning, with the polite warning about the market registration. He arrived at the front door in the late afternoon and told her, hat in hand and eyes on the floor, that Mr. Vane had heard she was planning a significant presence at the festival and wanted to make sure she was aware that vendor space registration for the festival was handled by the festival committee, and that the committee had certain rules about competing products, and that Mr. Vane had significant relationships with the committee. She looked at the young man. He really was uncomfortable. She almost felt sorry for him. "What's your name?" she said. He blinked. "Ma'am, your name," she said. "Ames," he said. "Tom Ames," she said. "I appreciate you coming out. I want you to tell Mr. Vane that I have my vendor registration, which I applied for last week, and that I received confirmation of my space yesterday morning." She had gone into town specifically for that purpose, because she had known this moment was coming. "Tell him also that the festival committee chairman confirmed to me personally that there are no rules restricting competing food products, as long as each vendor holds a valid registration, which I do." Tom Ames looked at her with the expression of a man who had hoped the errand would go differently. "I'll tell him," he said. "I hope he's well," she said, because she was who she was. He left. She closed the door and went back to the kitchen and checked the timing on the fourth proof cycle. On Thursday, Wyatt came home from a ride into town with a piece of information she had not expected. He had run into someone at the feed merchant, a rancher from the next county over, name of Bellamy, who had also been on the receiving end of Western Range Holdings letters and had also been buying grain from Silas Vane at elevated prices. Bellamy had put the pieces together in his own way, more slowly than Evelyn had, but he had gotten there, and Bellamy was angry. "He wants to talk," Wyatt said. "To who?" Evelyn asked. "To us," Wyatt said. "He said he knows 2 other ranchers in the same situation. He's been trying to figure out if there's a way to do something about it collectively." She set down the ladle in her hand. "Bring him to the festival," she said. Wyatt looked at her. "What?" "Tell Bellamy to come to the festival. Bring his information. If there are 4 ranches with the same pattern of overcharging in the same land company letters." She stopped because the implication was obvious and she didn't need to finish it. "That's not one man's complaint. That's a pattern. Patterns can be taken to people with authority to act on them." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "You think we can do that?" "I think the festival is the biggest gathering in the county," she said. "And I think that's exactly the kind of moment you use if you have it." He looked at her for a long moment. "I'll talk to Bellamy," he said. Friday was the day before the festival, and she spent most of it on production, the preliminary batches, the preserve jars, the pastry dough that needed to be made ahead and held overnight in the cold. Wyatt hauled 3 loads of firewood from the wood pile behind the barn and stacked them near the Dutch boxes without being asked. Dooley set up the wagon with the boards and brackets she had designed for transporting the product without crushing it, which Marsh had built to her specifications and which fit the wagon bed with approximately 2 inches to spare on each side. Marsh himself tuned the rebuilt first Dutch box one final time and declared it, with the quiet pride of a man who has solved a problem that resisted solving, ready. That evening she walked the yard by herself. The Dutch boxes were banked for the night. The wagon was loaded with the non-perishable items, and the kitchen was ready for the 4 a.m. start tomorrow. She stood in the quiet and looked at what 4 weeks of organized effort looked like from the outside. Looked like a yard, a wagon, 3 stone and iron bread ovens that a ranch hand had built from salvaged materials and perseverance. It did not look like much. She was going to take it into the largest commercial gathering in the county tomorrow, against a man with more money and more connections and more history in this place than she had, and she was going to make it matter. She was not certain it would be enough. She had never been certain of anything, she thought. People who claimed certainty about hard things were either lying to themselves or hadn't looked closely enough. What she had was a production plan she believed in, a counterfiling she trusted, a husband who was going to haul firewood at a festival when he had never hauled firewood for anyone, and 4 ranch hands who had eaten enough of her bread to feel like it meant something to help her sell it. She was afraid. Not in a way that stopped her. She had never been stopped by fear, which had sometimes been a problem, but in a real honest way. She let herself feel it for a moment, standing in the dark yard, before she put it somewhere she could function around it. Then she went inside and went to bed. She was awake again at 3:50, before the alarm she had set, staring at the ceiling. She got up, she put the coffee on, and she started the bread. The festival grounds smelled like wood smoke and horses and the particular kind of collective human energy that only gathers when a lot of people have traveled a distance to be in the same place at the same time. Evelyn had been awake since before 4. She had the first 2 batches out of the kitchen oven by 5:40, and the yard set up running by 6:15, which was 15 minutes later than her plan, because the rebuilt first Dutch box had taken longer to reach temperature than Marsh had predicted. Not a failure of the design, he explained, but a result of the morning air being colder than expected, which he had not accounted for. She did not blame him. She adjusted the timing on the 3rd batch and kept moving. Wyatt had been in the yard at 5. She had not asked him to be there that early. He had simply appeared, the way he sometimes appeared in the kitchen doorway before dawn, without announcement, without asking what was needed, just present and paying attention. He started hauling firewood from the stack to the boxes without being told. She noticed and said nothing, because saying something would have made it a moment when it was better as just a fact. By 7:30, the wagon was loaded. 216 loaves, she had counted them twice, because she was that kind of person. 48 jars of preserved 12 honey apple, and the rest a mixed berry she had developed over the past 2 weeks using dried fruit from the pantry and the last of the summer canning sugar. 32 pastry packets, which were something she had not originally planned for, but which Dooley had requested specifically after eating a test batch and describing them, with unusual eloquence for Dooley, as the kind of thing that makes a man feel like somebody cared about him today. She had put them in. Dooley drove the wagon. Wyatt rode alongside. Evelyn sat in the wagon bed for the first mile before she realized she could not sit still and moved to the bench beside Dooley, which made Dooley visibly pleased and slightly nervous at the same time. "You doing all right?" he said. "Ask me at the end of the day," she said. He nodded. He kept his eyes on the road. After a moment he said, "For what it's worth, I think you're going to do fine." "Thank you, Dooley." "I also think," he said, with the careful delivery of a man who knows he is approaching a line, "that if Vane tries anything today, Marsh is going to take it personally. Just so you know." She looked at him. "Tell Marsh to stay where I can see him, and not do anything that creates a problem we don't already have." "I'll pass that along," Dooley said, in those exact words. "That'll go great." The Harding Harvest Festival occupied 6 blocks of the main road and the fairground field beside it, and by 8 in the morning it was already loud. She had been to county fairs before, smaller ones, back home, the kind that smelled of hay and fried things, and the particular sweetness of bruised fruit, but this was larger than she had expected and more commercial. There were timber buyers and cattle merchants and equipment dealers, and 3 different grain operations with banners, and between all of that, the food vendors, which were her territory. She had been assigned a space on the east side of the vendor row, which was not the highest traffic position, but was not the worst either. It caught foot traffic from the livestock judging area, which would bring a steady stream of people through the morning. She set up the display board the way she had planned it, the bread loaves in rows, the preserve jars lined up with the labels facing out, the pastry packets in the wooden box Marsh had built specifically for transport and display. She had a price card written in her clearest hand. Wyatt had driven a second wagon with the portable setup, a folding iron stand that Marsh had constructed so they could do limited baking on site if the pre-made stock ran low. She had not planned to need it, but she had brought it because she was not the kind of person who planned for only the best case. By 8:30 she had 3 customers. By 9 she had a line. She had not expected a line. She had hoped for steady traffic. Line was something else, a visible signal to every person walking past that whatever was happening at this table was worth stopping for, which brought more people who saw the line and stopped, which made the line longer. She had seen this happen at market on a small scale. At festival scale, with the crowd density and the open-air smells carrying further, it was a different thing entirely. Wyatt appeared at her elbow at 9:15. "You need me on this side," he said. "Can you make change?" she asked. He looked at her. "I've been running a ranch for 12 years. Then yes," she said. "Get on this side." He moved around the table without another word and started taking money. He was not a natural salesman. He didn't have the warm, easy patter that some vendors used. The performed enthusiasm she always found slightly exhausting. He was simply direct and accurate, which turned out to be exactly right for the crowd, who were mostly ranchers and miners and the wives of ranchers and miners, people who trusted plainness more than charm. She watched him for a moment between customers. He was counting change with the same careful attention he brought to everything, and there was something in his posture, something looser than she usually saw, less contained, that she filed away without examining it too closely. She didn't have time to examine anything too closely. The line kept coming. Silas Vane arrived at 11. She saw him from a distance before he reached her table. That particular walk, the settled authority of it, the way the crowd seemed to part slightly without anyone quite meaning to. He had 2 men with him, which was one more than she had seen him bring before, and that number told her something. He stopped in front of her table. He looked at the display. He looked at the line of customers. He looked at her. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "you've done well for yourself this morning." "It's been a good morning," she said pleasantly. She did not stop wrapping a loaf for the woman at the front of the line. "I'll be with you in just a moment." He waited. She was not sure he had been made to wait for things very often, and she found in a distant part of her attention that she was not sorry for it. She finished the transaction, made change for a second customer, and then gave him her full attention. "What can I do for you?" she said. He smiled. It was the same smile it always was. "I wanted to have a conversation, maybe somewhere a little quieter." "I'm working," she said. "You're welcome to say whatever you'd like, right here." Something moved behind his eyes, not quite anger, but close enough. He looked at Wyatt, who was watching him from the other end of the table, with an expression that communicated nothing and everything at the same time. "I have a proposal," Vane said, "for the bread operation. I think it could be mutually beneficial." "Go ahead," she said. He had not expected her to say that. She could see it, the slight recalibration, the adjustment to a response that wasn't the one he had planned for. "I'm prepared to offer you $200, he said, "for the recipe, the starter culture, and the current client list. In addition, I'll withdraw the land registry claim and talk to the bank about restructuring Wyatt's remaining debt." The line had thinned slightly. The people nearest the table were not pretending not to listen. She was aware of that and decided it was not her problem to manage. She looked at Vane. $200, she said. It's a fair offer, he said. More than fair for a kitchen operation. And in exchange, I give you the recipe and the starter. And the client list, he said. Yes, she picked up the next loaf from the rack. And the land claim goes away. I'll see to it personally. And Wyatt's debt gets restructured. I have relationships with the bank, he said. It can be arranged. She wrapped the loaf. She thought about her grandmother's kitchen, about the crock on the shelf, about the 40 years of culture in that clay jar, and what it had taken to keep it alive, and what it had meant to two women, one of them gone now, to make something with their hands that people wanted. She thought about the 12 acres that were hers. She thought about the counterfiling she had submitted 6 days ago. She set the wrapped loaf on the table. No, she said. Vane looked at her. No, she said again, in case the first time had been unclear. The recipe is not for sale. The starter is not for sale. The client list is mine, and it stays mine. And the land claim, she looked at him steadily. I've already handled the land claim. He was very still for a moment. You should think about this more carefully. I've thought about it, she said. I've thought about it since the first morning I found what you were doing to the accounts. I've had a lot of time to think. She picked up the next loaf. The answer is no, she looked at Wyatt. Wyatt was looking at Vane. He had not moved from the other end of the table. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, in that flat, quiet voice that she had learned meant he had made up his mind about something, and nothing was going to change it. You should go. Vane's face had gone through several changes while she was speaking. The smoothness was still there, technically, but there was something underneath it now, a tightness she hadn't seen from him before. Something that looked, if she was reading it right, like a man beginning to understand that the situation had changed in ways he had not accounted for. He looked at her one more time. She looked back. She did not look away, and she did not fill the silence. He left. One of the two men with him glanced back. She did not watch them go. She turned to the next person in line. Honey apple or mixed berry, she said. Wyatt appeared beside her 10 minutes later. The rush had thinned again midday lull. She expected it to pick back up in the early afternoon, and she was reorganizing the table and tallying what was left. That was the offer he came to make, Wyatt said. It wasn't a question. Yes, she said. You should have told me he might do that. I wasn't certain he would. She looked up from the tally. Would it have changed anything? He thought about it. Honestly, which she respected, Wyatt Calloway did not perform consideration. He actually did it. I don't know, he said. I thought about the 200 when you said it. I thought about what it could do for the debt. I know you did, she said quietly. He looked at the table. But it's yours, he said. The recipe. The starter. Your grandmother's. I don't have the right to tell you to sell it. No, she said, you don't. And you don't need my permission, he said. I understand that now better than I did 2 months ago. She looked at him. He said things sometimes that came out of him differently than she expected, not polished, not prepared, just arrived at through whatever internal process he used to work through hard truths. This was one of those things. She believed him. We're going to be all right, she said, but not because of his $200, because of this. She gestured at the table, at the crowd, at the vendor row. What we built here. He was quiet for a moment. Then Bellamy's here, with 2 of the others. She straightened. Where? South end of the fairground. They came together, 4 of them in total, including one from the Meyer operation I hadn't heard about. He looked at her. They've got correspondence, records. More than I expected. The significance of that landed squarely. 4 operations. 4 sets of records. 4 patterns of overcharging and land company letters, all running through the same registered agent, all pointing toward the same end. That was not a dispute between one rancher and a supplier. That was something a county attorney could look at. That was something a state investigator could look at. I need 20 minutes to get through this table, she said. Then I want to talk to them. I'll tell them, Wyatt said. He paused. Evelyn, she looked at him. What you said to him just now. About the recipe. About it not being for sale. He seemed to be choosing words carefully, which for him meant the words mattered. I needed to hear that. Not because I would have told you to take the offer, I don't think I would have. But because I think I've been slow to understand what you've been protecting. She looked at him for a moment. What do you think I've been protecting? Yourself, he said. Not cruelly. Not even with particular weight. Just plainly the way he said most things. Not just the ranch. Not just the business, yourself. She held his gaze. The festival noise moved around them, voices and animals and hammering, and the smell of wood smoke and fried bread from the vendor 3 spaces down. Yes, she said, that's right. He nodded. He went to find Bellamy. The railway man found her at 2 in the afternoon. She almost missed it. She had spent the 20-minute break talking to Bellamy and the other 3 ranchers, and what she had seen in those documents had settled into her chest with a cold, specific weight that she was still carrying when she got back to the table. 4 ranches. The Bellamy operation, the Meyer family, a widow named Susanna Cole, who had sold 18 months ago at a price that was, given what she now knew, a fraction of what she should have received, and a fourth rancher named Greaves who had received his first Western Range letter 2 weeks ago and had come to the festival specifically because Bellamy had told him to. Cole had already sold. That couldn't be undone. But the other three had records, had letters, had grain receipts with the same systematic overcharging pattern that she had documented for the Calloway accounts. Taken together, it was enough. She had told them so. She had told them what they needed to do with it, who to take it to, what the process looked like, what to expect. Bellamy had looked at her like she had handed him something he had not known he was looking for. She had come back to the table and worked through the afternoon rush. She had sold 181 loaves by the time the rush peaked and thinned, 41 jars of preserve, and all 32 pastry packets. The pastry was gone by noon, which told her something about future pricing. She had also sold 9 loaves from the portable setup, which meant the on-site baking had been necessary after all, which meant Marsh had been right to build it, which was a fact she intended to tell him. The running total, which she was tracking in the margin of the small notebook she kept in her apron pocket, was $198.40 when the railway man stopped in front of her table. He was not what she had expected a railway buyer to look like, but she wasn't sure what she had expected. He was medium height, well-dressed in the specific way of someone who traveled often and had learned to dress for function over impression, and he was holding one of the last remaining honey apple loaves by its wrapping and looking at it with the focused attention of someone who is actually thinking rather than performing interest. "You make this?" he said. "I do," she said. He set it down and looked at her. "Where's it from? The apple flavor. It's not just dried apple. There's something underneath it." "The starter," she said. "It's old. The culture has a particular character that comes through in certain fruit combinations." "How old?" "The culture is 40 years old," she said, give or take. He was quiet for a moment. "You know what that's worth in a commercial context?" "I'm beginning to," she said. He introduced himself as James Whitfield, purchasing agent for the Kansas and Pacific Freight Line. He explained, in the focused, efficient way of someone who made deals regularly and had learned to skip the preamble, that the Railway Provisioning Division was in the business of supplying station dining rooms and passenger cars along 3 route segments, and that they sourced from regional producers when the quality and reliability met their standards. He said he had been at 12 vendor tables that morning, and none of them had made him stop and actually think. He said he had a provisioning need for baked goods on the northern segment that had been unmet for 2 months since their previous supplier had folded. She let him finish. Then she said, "What kind of volume are we talking about?" He named a figure weakly. "For 6 months initially with option to extend." She did the arithmetic in her head. It took approximately 4 seconds. Then she did it again, because the first result seemed large enough that she wanted to verify it. The second result matched the first. She kept her face still. "That's achievable," she said. "I'd need to discuss delivery logistics, and I'd need a written agreement before I change my production schedule for it." He pulled a card from his breast pocket. "My office address is on there. I'll be in Harding tomorrow evening. If you want to continue the conversation, come find me." He picked up the loaf. "I'm buying this," he said. "I'll need to taste the full product before I commit to anything." "Of course," she said. He paid. He left. She watched him go. Then she put both hands flat on the table and took one steady breath. $198.40 from the day's sales, plus whatever the Whitfield contract would produce, if it held, over 6 months. The ranch debt was real, and the grain situation was real, and Silas Vane was still somewhere in this county doing what he did. And none of that had resolved itself just because a railway man had stopped at her table. But the numbers had just changed, duly materialized beside her. "Who was that?" he said. "A potential buyer," she said. She picked up the notebook. "Go find Wyatt." Wyatt came back to the table at 3 o'clock. He had been with Bellamy for much of the afternoon, and she could see from his face that it had been a productive 2 hours. He had the look of a man who has spent time doing something useful and knows it, which was different from his ordinary expression in a way she could read now. She told him about Whitfield. She told him the number. She watched the arithmetic happen behind his eyes, the same process she had gone through. The multiplication, the verification, the stillness at the result. That's he started. "I know," she said. "If that comes through," she said. "It's not through yet. I'm meeting with him tomorrow." He looked at the table at what remained of the display, which was about 30 loaves and a scattering of preserved jars. He looked at the crowd. He looked at her. "What happened today," he said, "is more than I thought was possible 4 weeks ago. 4 weeks ago, we didn't have 3 Dutch boxes," she said. He almost smiled. The almost smile had been more frequent lately. She had stopped filing them away and started just noticing them directly. $214, she said. She had finished the count while she was waiting for him. With the last few sales after Whitfield, he was quiet for a long moment. We should talk, he said, tonight, about what comes next. About the attorney, about Bellamy's records, about how we use this. He gestured at the table, at the day. I want to do this right, so do I, she said. She started packing up the display methodically, the way she did everything. Jars first, then boards, then the wrapping materials. Wyatt picked up the heavier end of the display board without asking and held it while she folded the legs. Marsh appeared with the wagon. Dooley appeared with the portable setup, disassembled and strapped. The day was ending the way it had started, with all of them working, without formal direction, because by now they understood what needed doing. She looked up from the last crate and saw Silas Vane at the far end of the vendor row. He was standing still, watching her, not approaching. Just watching, with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not the smooth confidence, not the studied pleasantness. Something flatter than that. Something that looked, at this distance, like a man recalculating. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned back to the wagon and finished loading. They got back to the ranch as the sun was going down, the sky running orange and deep red along the western line. And she was tired in a way she had not been tired in a long time, the specific exhaustion of a day where everything was at stake, and most of it had gone right, which was somehow more draining than if things had gone badly, because at least with a disaster you knew what you were dealing with. She sat at the kitchen table and took off her boots and put her feet on the chair opposite and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Wyatt came in from seeing to the horses and poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her without asking. Thank you, she said. He sat across from her. He wrapped both hands around his cup the way he did when he was thinking about something he was about to say. I want to talk about Grant Holloway, he said. She knew the name. Holloway was the attorney in Harding, not a large practice, but the one that the county's more legitimate business dealings ran through, the one that Bellamy had mentioned when she asked who handled his property filing. He was, from what she had heard, thorough and not easily pressured. You want to hire him, she said. I want to take him Bellamy's records and ours and everything we have on Western Range Holdings and the registered agent and ask him what he can do with it. He looked at his coffee. I should have done this months ago, before I understood what I was dealing with. You didn't know what you were dealing with months ago, she said. I should have looked, he said. It came out with some weight behind it, not self-pity, just the plain acknowledgement of a man who has identified his own failure and is not going to prettify it. The accounts were there, the letters were there. I didn't look. She held her coffee cup. Wyatt, you were running a ranch. You were doing what you knew how to do. And you walked in and looked at the accounts in 10 days. I was looking because I had nothing else, she said simply. I had no history here, no relationships, no established way of doing things. The accounts were what I had access to, she paused. Sometimes being the outsider is the advantage. He was quiet. We're going to hire Holloway, she said. And we're going to take him everything. And we're going to see what he can build from it. She set her cup down. But I want to be in that meeting. He looked at her. Of course, not as Wyatt Calloway's wife, she said. As the person who found the pattern in the accounts. He held her gaze for a moment. Something in his face settled, not surprised, not resistant. Just steady. That's what you are, he said. She picked up her coffee again. Outside, the wind had started its evening habit, moving through the yard the way it did at this hour, pushing at the windows and finding the gaps. She had stopped noticing it, mostly, which she supposed meant the place had gotten into her in some way she hadn't been tracking. There's something else, she said. What? She set the cup down. This was the thing she had been thinking about since the conversation with Vane at the festival table, since the moment she had said no and meant it, since Wyatt had stood at the other end of the table and told Vane to go. The bread business, she said. The way we set it up, it's been informal. No official registration under my name, no separate account. Everything running through the household. I want to change that. He looked at her. I want to register it properly, she said. Under my name, not the ranch name. Mine, she said it directly because there was no way to say it that wasn't direct. The business I built. It should be mine in the same way it is in practice. Wyatt looked at the table for a moment. She waited. She had become genuinely patient with his silences over these weeks, not resigned to them, not frustrated by them the way she had been at first, but actually patient because she had learned that what came out of them was usually worth waiting for. That's fair, he said, 2 words, straightforward. No qualification. When we talked to Holloway, he said we can ask him how to structure it. She nodded. She looked at the kitchen, at the stove and the counter and the shelf, where the bread starter sat in its crock, fed this morning, alive and working the way it always was, without any drama, just doing the thing it had been doing for 40 years, because that's what it did. We made $214 today, she said. Yes, he said, and we may have a railway contract. Yes. And Bellamy has 4 ranches worth of evidence against Vane. Yes, she looked at him. 2 months ago, you had a supplier problem. You didn't know how to name. And a ranch bleeding out through an account you hadn't looked at in 6 months. Yes, he said. We're not out of it yet, she said. The debt is still real. The grain situation is still real. Holloway costs money we'll have to budget for. I know, he said. But it's different now, she said. He held her gaze across the kitchen table, in the lamplit quiet of the house at the end of the longest day she had spent in Kansas, and he said, Yes, it's different now. She finished her coffee. She was going to bed soon early, because tomorrow she had to meet with Whitfield, and she needed to be sharp for it. But she sat for a few more minutes because the kitchen was warm, and the wind outside was doing its evening thing, and there was something she didn't want to rush past. Wyatt sat across from her and did not fill the silence with anything, which was one of the things about him that she had stopped cataloging as a neutral trait and started understanding as something she actively valued. It had been a long day. There was still a long road ahead of them. But in this particular moment, the bread was sold, the money was real, and Silas Vane had stood at her table and heard the word no, and understood, perhaps for the first time, that the situation had changed in a way he had not engineered and could not easily reverse. That was enough for tonight. She got up and washed her cup and went to bed. The meeting with James Whitfield lasted 40 minutes. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything methodically the night before, sitting at the kitchen table with a clean sheet of paper and writing out every number she needed to know, every question she expected him to ask, every condition she was willing to accept, and every condition she was not. By the time she walked into the Harding Hotel dining room, where he had suggested they meet, she had the whole shape of it in her head, and she was not nervous in the way she had been nervous before the festival. That had been a different kind of stakes. This was just a negotiation, and she had been negotiating her way through one thing or another, since she was old enough to understand that the world did not automatically give you what was fair. Whitfield was already there when she arrived. He had ordered coffee and was reading something, and he looked up when she came in without the performative some men deployed when a woman arrived to conduct business, that slight overemphasis on courtesy that communicated, underneath it, that they hadn't quite expected her to show up. He just looked up, noted her arrival, and gestured to the chair across from him. She sat. She ordered coffee. They talked. He wanted 200 loaves per week to start, delivered to the Harding station on Mondays for distribution along the northern segment. If the quality held and the reliability held, the order would increase at the 3-month mark. The contract would run 6 months with a 30-day renewal option on each side. He named a price per loaf that was above what she had been charging at market, which she had expected. Railway provisioning operated on different margins than retail, and she had done enough reading to understand that, and she countered with a slightly higher number on the grounds of delivery cost, which he accepted after a pause that told her he had budgeted for the counter. She asked for payment on delivery rather than net 30. He looked at her. She explained without apology that she was a small producer and that net 30 created cash flow problems she wasn't in a position to absorb. He thought about it for approximately 15 seconds and agreed. She asked for a written contract rather than a handshake arrangement. He said he preferred it that way himself. They shook hands at the end of the 40 minutes. He had a standard contract form in his bag he had come prepared, which she respected, and they filled in the figures together, both read it through, and both signed. She folded her copy and put it in her coat pocket. Outside the hotel, she stood on the boardwalk in the thin November air and did the arithmetic one more time. 200 loaves per week at the contracted rate. 48 weeks in the contract, roughly, with renewal possible. She did not count the renewal because she did not count on things that hadn't happened yet. But even the base contract, even the 6 months alone, was a number that changed what the Calloway Ranch looked like to a bank that was deciding whether to work with them or against them. She walked to the attorney's office. Grant Holloway was a compact, deliberate man in his late 40s who had the organized stillness of someone who had spent decades listening carefully and had long ago stopped feeling the need to fill silences with his own voice. His office was not large, but it was orderly in a way that communicated competence rather than pretension, the right books in the right places. The papers on his desk arranged in a way that suggested active use rather than performance. Wyatt was already there when she arrived. He had ridden in ahead of her while she was meeting with Whitfield, and he had brought the folder, their folder, the one she had compiled over the past 2 months, with the grain receipts and the account ledger copies and the Western Range Holdings letters and the registered agent documentation and everything else they had gathered. Bellamy had sent his records ahead by messenger 2 days earlier. The Meyer and Greaves documentation had arrived the same way. Holloway had it all spread across his desk when she walked in, and he was reading with the focused, slightly removed attention of a man who has been handed something and is determining, on the fly, how significant it is. He looked up when she came in. Wyatt introduced her. Holloway shook her hand across the desk and said, "You compiled this?" "Most of it," she said. The other ranchers contributed their own records. He looked back at the papers. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He asked questions for the next hour. Not the kind of questions that tested whether she knew what she was talking about. She could tell within the first 5 minutes that he had already assessed the documentation and formed a view, but the specific, technical questions of someone who is building a case in his head and needs the gaps filled. When did she first notice the pricing discrepancy? How had she identified the Western Range Holdings connection? What was the sequence of events between the grain cut and the festival? Whether she had kept the original envelope the land registry letter had arrived in. She had kept the envelope. He looked at her when she said that, with the faint expression of someone who has been pleasantly surprised, and is not quite sure how to show it without being condescending about it. She waited for him to say something about it, and he did not, which she preferred. "The land claim," he said. "You filed the counter yourself." "I did," she said. "And the documentation is complete?" "It was accepted by the registry clerk as complete," she said. "I have the receipt." He sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, a thinking gesture. She recognized it as that, the same way Wyatt rubbed the back of his neck. Then he looked at the desk and then at both of them. "This is enough to file a formal complaint with the State Land Commission," he said. The pattern across 4 operations, combined with the registered agent connection between Vane's legal representation and Western Range Holdings, establishes a scheme rather than individual disputes. That distinction matters enormously. He paused. It also means the complaint has teeth. Vane's attorney, this Pruitt, is going to have a problem, because filing a fraudulent land claim on behalf of a client is not a small thing. That alone may be enough to unravel the land company arrangement. "And the grain overcharging?" Wyatt asked. "Civil matter, primarily. But given the pattern and the amount for operations, cumulative losses over 14 months, there's an argument for damages that a state court would take seriously." He looked at Wyatt. "I won't promise you a particular outcome. I don't make promises about things I can't guarantee. What I can tell you is that what you've brought me is not nothing. It's considerably more than nothing." Evelyn looked at the papers on the desk. At the grain receipts she had found on the kitchen shelf 6 days into her marriage. At the account ledger she had stayed up half the night to read. At the Western Range Holdings letters that had been sitting behind a file folder for 8 months, waiting for someone to understand what they meant. "What do we do first?" she said. "First," Holloway said, "I draft the complaint to the State Land Commission. That starts the formal process and establishes a record. Second, I send a letter to Pruitt informing him that the counterfiling on your property is supported by complete documentation and that we are prepared to pursue the claim of fraudulent filing if the original claim is not withdrawn." He looked at her. "In my experience, when an attorney of Pruitt's caliber understands that the fraudulent filing itself is going to become a matter of record, the original claim tends to disappear quickly." "And Vane?" Wyatt said. Holloway was quiet for a moment. "Vane is more complicated. He has money and he has connections and he will hire better legal representation than Pruitt when he understands what he's facing. This is not going to resolve itself in 2 weeks." He looked at both of them steadily. "But the grain overcharging documentation, combined with the state commission complaint, is going to make it very difficult for him to continue doing business the way he has been. Other ranchers in the county who have been paying his prices are going to start asking questions. That kind of scrutiny is damage he doesn't recover from quickly, regardless of what happens in a formal proceeding." "The bank?" Evelyn said. "The debt restructuring. That I can help with directly," Holloway said. "I have a working relationship with the Harding Bank's regional manager. If you bring me the railway contract and the current account position, I can present a restructuring argument that demonstrates the ranch's improved revenue trajectory. Banks are in the business of getting paid. If you can show them a credible path to payment, they will generally prefer it to the alternative." She reached into her coat and put the railway contract on his desk. He looked at it. He read the first page. He looked at her. "You signed this morning," he said. 40 minutes before I came here," she said. He read the rest of it. He set it down. He looked at both of them with the expression of a man who has revised his assessment upward and is deciding whether to say so. "This helps," he said. They rode home in the early afternoon. Wyatt on his horse, Evelyn in the small wagon she had driven in. The sky had gone flat and gray, the way Kansas skies went in November, pressing down close to the land, and the wind was the cold kind now, not the warm summer pushing she had arrived in. She had her coat buttoned to the throat and her hands on the reins, and she was thinking about the conversation in Holloway's office, not reviewing it anxiously, the way she sometimes reviewed things she was uncertain about, but settling into it, letting it become real. Wyatt rode up beside the wagon. He matched her pace without saying anything for a while. You brought the railway contract, he said eventually. I knew we were going to need it, she said. You signed it this morning and brought it straight to Holloway. Yes, he was quiet. You planned that. I planned to have it when we needed it, she said. That's not the same as planning for a particular outcome. He rode beside her for another stretch of road. The bare trees along the creek line moved in the wind. A hawk was doing something slow and purposeful over the eastern field. I haven't said this clearly, he said, and I should. She looked at him. You did what you've been doing since the first week you got here. I didn't know what I had. He said it without looking at her, which she thought was because he was one of those people who found it easier to say hard, true things when he wasn't watching the person receive them. I thought I was getting someone to manage a household. I thought that was the arrangement. I didn't think he stopped. Started again. I didn't see you. Not at first I saw what I expected to see, which was a woman who was capable and organized and who could run a kitchen. I didn't see the rest of it. She kept her eyes on the road. When did you start seeing it? He thought about it honestly, the way he did. The night you showed me the Western Range letters, he said. When you said it wasn't just about money, that it was about making us weak. He paused. I'd been looking at those letters for 8 months, and I saw an offer I didn't want. You saw what the offer was actually made of. She did not say anything to that. She let it sit between them in the way that real things deserve to sit, without being filled in or predified or resolved too quickly. I want to register the business in your name, he said. I want to do it properly with Holloway the way you said, not as something I'm giving you, as something you built, and that should be yours in the way it already is. I know the difference, she said. I know you do, he said. I want you to know that I do. The wagon wheels on the frozen road made a sound that was different from the summer sound, harder, more percussive, the ground refusing to give. She had noticed, over these months, how much of Kansas communicated through sound before it communicated through anything else. The wind, the grass, the wood contracting in the cold. She had stopped being a stranger to those sounds, she realized. She had absorbed them somewhere along the way without ceremony. It started as an arrangement, she said. Yes, he said. A practical one. Yes, she looked at the road ahead. It's not that anymore. He was quiet for a moment. No, he said, it's not. She did not ask him to elaborate. He did not offer to. But when she looked sideways at him, he was looking at the road with the expression she had learned to read, as the one that he was carrying something he didn't have the words for yet, and was not going to perform words he didn't have. She understood that expression better than almost any other he had. They rode the rest of the way home without saying much else, and it was the comfortable kind of quiet, the kind that meant something had been said and didn't need to be repeated. The land claim was withdrawn 11 days later. She found out through a letter from the registry office, formal, stamped, the correct language in the correct places. The original claim had been voluntarily dismissed by the filing party. Her counterfiling stood. The 12 acres were hers, uncontested on record. She read the letter at the kitchen table. She folded it and put it with the other documents in the file she kept in the second drawer of the kitchen dresser, where she kept everything that mattered. Then she fed the bread starter and started the morning batch. She didn't make a ceremony of it. She had learned in her life to be careful about treating the resolution of bad things as if the resolution was the whole story, because usually it wasn't. The land claim being withdrawn was not the end of anything. It was one thread pulled free. There were still other threads. Holloway had filed the State Land Commission complaint 3 days after their meeting. He had told them it would take time, weeks, possibly months before the commission responded in any formal way. State processes moved at state speeds which were not fast. But the complaint was on record, and the 4 ranches were named in it, and the Western Range Holdings connection was documented, and Pruitt's name was in it, in a way that he was going to have to respond to. She had heard through Dooley, who heard things through a network she had stopped trying to understand, that Pruitt had resigned from the Western Range Holdings registered agent position the same week. Holloway sent him the letter. She didn't know if that was true. She filed it as a rumor that was probably directionally accurate, which was what most rumors were. The bank restructuring meeting happened on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after the festival. Holloway had arranged it had sat down with the regional manager and presented the railway contract, and the revised account position and the ranch's trajectory, all of it in the patient, non-dramatic language of someone who had done this kind of presentation many times, and knew that what banks responded to was not urgency but credibility. Evelyn had been in that meeting. She had not spoken much. She had let Holloway do the presenting, because that was what they had agreed, but she had been there, and she had answered 2 questions the manager addressed directly to her about the bread operation's scalability and the delivery arrangement. And she had answered them clearly and specifically, with numbers, the way she answered every question that had numbers in it. The restructuring was approved. The terms were not generous. Banks were not in the business of generosity, but they were workable. The new payment schedule aligned with the ranch's actual revenue, rather than the fiction of what the revenue should have been before Vane's overcharging had hollowed it out. And the railway contract income provided a floor that the manager had found reassuring in the specific way that bankers found reliable recurring income reassuring. She had driven home from that meeting in something close to silence. Not the heavy silence of unresolved things, but the tired silence of things that had taken enormous effort and had worked, and she was running on the last of what she had, and she knew it. Silas Vane left Harding County in late November. Not dramatically. Not overnight. He did not flee in the way the stories sometimes described men like him. Fleeing, there was no midnight ride, no burned records, nothing that clean. He simply began over the course of 3 weeks to be less present. His name appeared less often in the feed merchants' conversations. His operation reduced its public-facing contracts. A man who had been visible in a county for years, who had cultivated visibility the way some men cultivated land, became less visible. She heard about it, the same way she heard about most things through Dooley, through Bellamy when he came by to compare notes, through the specific texture of a small county's information network that she had stopped being foreign to. The state commission investigation was ongoing. It would continue to be ongoing for longer than felt satisfying. That was the nature of formal investigations. She had made her peace with it early, because she was not someone who could afford to wait for complete resolution before she kept working. The investigation was running. The documentation was submitted. Calloway was handling it. That was all she could do. What she knew concretely, Western Range Holdings had not made any additional offers to any ranch in the county since the complaint was filed. The Meyer family had received a formal acknowledgement from the commission that their case was under review. Greaves had received the same. Bellamy had spoken to a county official who had been oblique but not dismissive, which was, Bellamy said, better than he had expected. The widow Cole, who had already sold, was a different matter. There was no simple way to undo a completed sale, and Evelyn had spent one long afternoon with Holloway going through the options, which were limited and slow. Holloway was pursuing a damages claim on Cole's behalf. She had agreed to allow it, but he had been honest with both of them about the likelihood and the timeline. It might result in something, it might not. The law was not always proportional to the harm. She had told Cole this herself in a brief meeting at Heller's store, because she thought Cole deserved to hear it directly rather than through a lawyer's summary. Cole was a small, quiet woman who had sold her operation at a price that had felt like a lifeline at the time, and who now understood it had been a fraction of what she should have received. She had listened to Evelyn's summary with the composed steadiness of a person who has already done their grieving in private. "I appreciate you telling me straight," Cole had said. "I thought you were owed that," Evelyn said. Cole had looked at her for a moment. "How did you know to look?" she said. "At the accounts. At all of it." "How did you know there was something to look for?" Evelyn had thought about how to answer that honestly. "I didn't," she said finally. "I just looked because I had nothing else to do at midnight and the numbers were there." She paused. "I think that's most of it. Most of what looks like foresight is just being unable to sleep and having the accounts in front of you." Cole had almost smiled at that. It was the closest thing to a shared moment they had, and it was enough. The bread business was registered formally under her name on a Tuesday morning in December in Holloway's office, with Wyatt present and Holloway doing the notarizing. The name on the registration was simple: Evelyn Hart Calloway, sole proprietor, Calloway Ranch Bakery, Harding County, Kansas. She had not expected to feel much about it. She had spent enough time working toward the thing that the thing itself often felt anticlimactic when it arrived. But holding the registration paper was different from how she had expected. It was a piece of paper. It was also the first time in her adult life that something was formally, legally, publicly hers. Not hers by inheritance, not hers in practice, hers on record, in her name, as something she had built. She folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket. Wyatt shook Holloway's hand and they exchanged a few words about the ongoing commission matter. She watched Wyatt in Holloway's office, the way he carried himself with the attorney, the directness of it, the willingness to engage on terms that were not entirely his own, and thought about the man who had not looked at his own accounts for 6 months. People were not fixed things. That was something she had believed in the abstract for a long time, and had been watching become concrete for the past 3 months. Outside, he held the door for her, which he had stopped doing when he thought she didn't want it, and had resumed doing when he understood she didn't mind it, that she understood it as consideration rather than condescension. They walked out into the December street together. "You're quiet," he said. "I'm thinking," she said. "About what?" She looked at the street. At the feed merchants and the dry goods store, and the hotel where she had met Whitfield, and the town hall where she had paid her $2 vendor registration on a morning, when she had not yet understood the full shape of what she was walking into. She had been in this county for 3 months. She had arrived as someone's practical wife, and she was leaving this street as something else. Something she didn't have a single word for, which was fine. She didn't need a word for it. About what it took to get here, she said. He walked beside her toward the wagon. Good or bad? Both, she said. Neither. She thought about it for another moment. I keep thinking about what I would have done if I hadn't found the grain records that first night. If I'd gone to bed and slept through, and not been the kind of person who opens a ledger at midnight. She paused. I don't know what happens to this ranch in that version. I don't know what happens to us, but you did find them, he said. I did, she said, but it wasn't skill exactly. It was insomnia and stubbornness, and having a grandmother who taught me to read a column of numbers like they were telling a story. She looked at him sideways. I'm not as capable as I probably look from the outside. I was just here and I was awake and I looked. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. I think, he said slowly, that being here and awake and willing to look is most of what capable actually is. She considered that. Maybe, she said. Most people aren't, he said, present and awake and looking. Most people are doing other things, protecting themselves from what they might find. She thought about that for the rest of the walk to the wagon. Winter settled over the ranch the way it always had, the way it would the following year and the year after that, without asking anyone's permission. The creek along the eastern fence froze in the shallow places. The morning fires took longer to catch. The horses grew their winter coats and stood in the barn afternoons in the comfortable collective warmth of animals that have spent enough winters together to understand that the cold is survivable if you don't face it alone. The first railway delivery went out on a Monday morning in December, 2 weeks after the contract was signed. Dooley drove it in the big wagon, with Evelyn beside him and 200 loaves stacked in the careful rack system that Marsh had refined twice since the festival. And they arrived at the Harding station early enough that the station agent was still drinking his first coffee when they pulled up. The agent looked at the wagon. He looked at the crates. He smelled the bread through the wrapping. She had put a small sample loaf in a separate bag at the front, as Whitfield had suggested, and he cut it open and ate a piece standing in the cold morning air and said, well, that was all. Just well, in the tone of voice that covered a range of things, all of them positive. The delivery was signed for. The payment was received on the spot, as agreed. She put it in the cash envelope she carried for this purpose, and put the envelope in her coat pocket with the business registration, which she had been carrying there every day for 2 weeks, because she had not yet found a better place for it, or perhaps because she was not ready to put it away. On the ride home, Dooley said, how does it feel? She thought about it. Like the beginning of something, she said. Good beginning or hard beginning? Both, she said. Usually is. He nodded, with the wisdom of a man who had lived long enough to agree with that without needing to discuss it further. On an evening in late December, Wyatt came in from checking the southern fence and sat down at the kitchen table, without his usual purpose, not looking for coffee, not reaching for the ledger, just sitting. She was at the stove. She did not ask him what he was thinking about, because she had learned that asking that question was often less useful than waiting. After a while, he said, I want to tell you something. She turned down the heat and turned around. He gestured at the kitchen, at the house, at something larger than either of those. When I put the advertisement in, when I wrote the letters, I was looking for someone to manage things. I was practical about it, in a way that I think now was more defended than practical. He looked at the table. I was protecting myself from wanting something I wasn't sure I could have. She waited. Somewhere in the last 3 months, he said, that stopped being the arrangement we had. He looked up at her, and I want to say that clearly because I'm not always... He stopped. I don't always say things clearly. I know that. She dried her hands on her apron and sat down across from him. What do you want to say clearly, she said. That if I could start it over, he said, knowing what I know now, knowing who you are, I would choose this. Not as an arrangement, as a choice. He held her gaze. I would choose you. The kitchen was warm. The bread starter was on the shelf, doing its quiet, patient work the way it always did. Outside, the wind had gone still, which it sometimes did in December, those pockets of cold silence that settled over the plains without warning. She looked at him for a moment. He was not a smooth man. He had not delivered that speech smoothly. It had come out in pieces, with the specific awkwardness of someone who is saying a true thing in their own imperfect voice, rather than a practiced one. She trusted it more for that. I would choose this too, she said. But I want to be clear about my conditions. Something moved in his face. Not alarmed, something more like the readiness of a person who has learned over these months that her conditions were usually worth listening to. The business is mine, she said, not mine and the ranch's. Mine. Whatever we build together on this ranch, that stays separate and under my name. Yes, he said, I already agreed to that. I know, she said. I'm saying it again because I want it said between us, not just on paper. She paused. And we make decisions together. Not you making them and telling me afterward. Not me working around you. Together. Yes, he said. And then, quietly, I've been learning that. I'm not done learning it. Neither am I, she said. I'm not particularly easy either. I know that. He almost smiled. The almost smile had become, over the months, something she had stopped cataloging and started simply looking forward to. No, he said, you're not easy. I know, but you're honest, he said. And you see things clearly. And you don't stop when it gets hard. He looked at his hands, then back at her. Those aren't small things. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she got up and went back to the stove, because supper was not going to finish itself, and there were still things to do before the day was done. But something had settled between them that evening, not dramatically, not with the weight that resolution sometimes carries in the moment. Just quietly, the way real things settle, the way the ranch had settled into her over 3 months without ceremony, the way the Kansas sky had become, without her deciding it would, something she recognized. By winter's end, the Calloway ranch was different. Not unrecognizable, it was still the same land, the same buildings, the same horses in the same barn. Dooley was still the first one up most mornings, still appearing in the kitchen doorway with his coffee cup and his running commentary on the state of the world. Marsh had built 2 more improvements to the yard setup that nobody had asked for, and that both worked better than expected. The eastern fence had been repaired and held through the frost. But the grain came now from 3 different suppliers, none of them vain, at prices that she had negotiated herself, with Wyatt present and co-signing, after she had done the comparative pricing work that told her what the market actually looked like, when you weren't being controlled by someone who had arranged for you not to know. The price they paid per bushel was 24 cents. The price they had been paying vain at the end was 47. The State Commission investigation produced its formal findings in late winter. The findings confirmed a pattern of fraudulent land filings connected to Western Range Holdings across 6 operations in 3 counties, more than even Bellamy had known about. The registered agent connection to Vane's legal representation was noted. The commission referred the matter to the state attorney for further action, which was not a conviction and was not immediate justice, but was a public record that named names and described a scheme in the specific, dry language of official findings, which was its own kind of consequence. Pruitt's law license was under review. She did not know what would come of that. Holloway was cautiously optimistic, which from Holloway meant something. Vane had not returned to Harding County in any visible way. His name still appeared on some county contracts. He had enough of a web that it didn't disappear overnight, but the web was unraveling in the specific way that webs unravel when the center stops holding. Slowly, strand by strand. It was not the clean, complete defeat that anger sometimes demanded. It was the slower, messier version of justice that was more honest about what justice actually looked like. She had made her peace with that. Not easily, she was not someone who made peace with things easily, and the widow Cole was still waiting on a damages process that moved at a pace that felt like an insult. But she had made it, because the alternative was spending the rest of her time here, in a state of waiting for a completeness that real life generally didn't provide. The bread business delivered every Monday morning without exception. In February, Whitfield's office sent a letter confirming the order increase they had discussed at the 3-month mark. She had budgeted for it, not counted on it. Budgeted for it, and when it arrived, she had added the new numbers to the ledger column and kept moving. She had also, by February, taken on 2 local women to help with production on the high-volume days, not as employees exactly, because she did not yet have the scale for formal employees, but as a regular working arrangement with wages paid on time and tasks divided by skill. One of them was the boarding house woman whose standing order had been one of the first real commercial accounts. The other was a woman named Ruth, who had shown up at the ranch door in December, asking if the bakery that was mentioned at the festival was hiring, and who turned out to have an instinctive understanding of temperature and timing that made her immediately useful and eventually indispensable. The business was not a large operation. She was not going to pretend it was something it wasn't. But it was real, it was documented, it was hers. And it was growing in the way that things grow when they're built on something solid, not fast, not dramatic, just steady. On a Thursday morning in March, she was at the kitchen counter when she heard Wyatt come in from the yard. It was the particular time of morning she had come to think of as the good hour, the bread already in the oven, the coffee on, the light coming in from the east, in that early flat way that made everything look clean. He washed at the basin and poured his coffee, and came to stand near her the way he sometimes did at this hour, not interrupting anything, just present. She could smell the bread from the oven, honey apple, which she made every Thursday, which had become the day she used for the oldest recipe, because Thursday was the day. The starter was at its peak activity after the Monday feeding cycle. The smell of it filled the kitchen in that specific way. It always did, that warm, particular sweetness that she had known since she was small, that she had carried across a state in a clay crock packed in straw that had become, without anyone deciding it would, the smell of this house on Thursday mornings. Wyatt stood at the counter with his coffee. He was looking at the window, which was what he did when he was thinking about something he might say later. She let him think. She shaped the last loaf with practiced hands press, fold, turn, and set it in the pan. Some things she had learned over these months were things she had expected to learn. The accounts, the suppliers, the legal processes, the rhythm of a ranch operation seen from the inside. The specific difficulties of building a business from a kitchen while simultaneously managing a household, a marriage, and a legal dispute. The way good work done consistently competes, and the way hard situations reveal people for who they are when the pressure doesn't let up. Some things she had not expected. She had not expected to find in a man who had advertised for a practical wife, someone who was capable of changing. Not overnight, not completely, not without backsliding sometimes into the old patterns of doing everything alone and deciding first and explaining later, but genuinely capable of it in the specific way that matters: the willingness to recognize where you've been wrong and keep trying to do better, not because it's comfortable, but because you've decided it's right. She had not expected the ranch to become home. She had expected it to become familiar, which was a different thing. Home was something she had associated with the house where her grandmother had lived, with the kitchen and the bread smell and the sense of being known. She had not thought she would find it here, but here it was, in the Thursday morning light and the bread in the oven and the man drinking his coffee by the window. She thought about her grandmother sometimes, about what the old woman would have made of all this: the festival, the railway contract, the legal complaint, the formal business registration. She thought the old woman would have had something dry and specific to say about it, something that managed to be both amused and proud in the same breath. She hoped so. The timer she had rigged from a pocket watch told her the bread needed another 12 minutes. She set it back on the counter and poured herself the last of the coffee. "Wyatt," she said. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said, "for standing with me at the table that day when I said no." He was quiet for a moment. "You didn't need me to." "No," she said, "but you did it anyway." He looked at his coffee. "It wasn't hard," he said. "Once I understood what you were protecting." She thought about what he had said months ago on the road home from Holloway's office, that being present and awake and willing to look was most of what capable actually was. She thought he was right about that. She also thought it was what she would carry from this. Whatever else came or didn't come, not the business registration, not the railway contract, not even the account ledger she had opened on her first sleepless night. The idea that most of what we can offer each other, in any arrangement we make our lives from, is the willingness to look. To not turn away from the accounts or the letters or the things that make us uncomfortable because looking at them might mean we have to act. The kitchen smelled like Thursday, like honey and apple and something alive and warm. She picked up her coffee and looked out the window at the March morning, the yard, the Dutch boxes, the pasture beyond. The horses were out, moving across the frost-pale grass with the unhurried certainty of animals that know where they belong. She was not a woman who had arrived here with a plan. She had arrived with a clay crock and a set of account books she hadn't been given, and a stubbornness that had served her better than she sometimes wished it had. She had not saved this ranch because she was extraordinary. She had saved it because she was present, because she was awake, because she had opened a ledger at midnight and read what it said and decided that the truth, however inconvenient, was something she could work with. That was the whole of it. That was enough. The timer ran out. She went to check the bread.